Damien's point of view.
I glanced down at the damn rock, now sealed tight, its magic flickering out like a light being abruptly cut off at night, leaving entire neighborhoods in darkness. And just like that, I was left in the dark too. The only thing it confirmed was that the witch I'd been tracking was somewhere in this town. The question was, where do I begin? I looked up at the chaotic bar in front of me. Stepping inside, I immediately felt it, an overwhelming surge of energy in the air. I pushed through the crowd, the noise of the bar buzzing in my ears, the thick scent of alcohol and sweat hanging heavy in the air. Magic crackled all around me, a low hum that made my skin crawl. She was close. I could feel it. Whoever this witch was, I was getting closer to her. But then a shadow loomed in front of me, broad and blocking the way. The guy was taller than me and built like a brick wall. I could already sense it, the weight of his presence, the raw power he radiated. "Vampires aren't welcome here," he growled, voice rough and menacing. "Especially not special ones like you." I narrowed my eyes, my instincts kicking in. The man's scent hit me, something wild, earthy. A werewolf. Not just any werewolf, though. An alpha. I could feel the dominance dripping off him like a poison, thick enough to make anyone back down. I stood tall, my gaze steady. "Move," I said, my voice low, cold. He didn't flinch, just grinned, his teeth flashing like a warning. "I told you, vampire, you're not welcome in my bar." I wasn't here to argue. I had one thing on my mind, finding her. But his presence, his defiance, was a problem, a big one. I took a step forward, my eyes never leaving him, every part of me vibrating with the need to push past him. But he wasn't having it. He shoved me back, hard. I stumbled but didn't fall. The growl he let out echoed through the bar, vibrating through the loud music, and I felt the energy shift. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, the eyes of every single person locked on us. The tension was suffocating. "Vampires aren't allowed in my bar," he roared. The crowd tensed, some of them waiting for a fight, others just eager for the chaos. But I wasn't here for that. I wasn't about to waste my time on some werewolf alpha in a bar. I had a task, and I wasn't going to let some loudmouth get in my way. But the way he stood, daring me to make a move, pissed me off. It was the kind of challenge I didn't back down from, the kind of fight I could finish in seconds. Still, I kept my cool. I didn't have time for this. I took another step, closer now, my eyes flashing with the promise of something much worse if he didn't step aside. "Move," I said again, quieter this time, but there was no mistaking the threat in it. The alpha's eyes flicked toward the others who had frozen in place, their half-empty beer bottles suspended in midair, waiting, watching, like the whole room was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But I didn't care about them. My attention snapped back to their alpha, who was looking me over with an intensity that made the air vibrate. And then, without warning, he shifted, just halfway, his bones contorting, skin stretching as fur began to sprout from his arms and neck. The transformation was brutal and swift. His face morphed into the snout of a wolf, and a deep growl rumbled in his throat. He was barely human now, and the shift was a clear message. He wasn't backing down. I was about to respond, but something caught my attention. A flicker of movement, something that didn't belong in the chaos of the moment. A woman, standing in the corner of my vision. She didn't belong here. And yet her presence felt familiar. Her red hair shimmered like fire under the dim lights, and for a second, my heart stopped. But before I could focus, she melted into the crowd, her figure disappearing into the throng of people, leaving nothing but a glimpse of crimson hair in her wake. I shook my head, clearing my mind, but then she was gone, slipping away like smoke in the wind. My attention snapped back to the Alpha, whose claws were now inches from my chest. He nudged me roughly, the sharp tips of his claws scraping against my skin, slicing through my shirt like it was paper. The pain was instant, but it wasn't enough to draw a reaction. His power, his dominance, it was all part of the game. I met his gaze, my own eyes icy, and I knew right then that this wasn't going to end in some simple brawl. The bar was already on the edge. Half of them were practically vibrating with the urge to shift, ready to tear into me the moment this guy of an Alpha gave the signal. But as tempting as it was, as fascinating as it was to picture what that fight might look like, I didn't have the luxury of time. Fighting them, let alone their dick Alpha, wasn't part of the plan. I wasn't here for bloodshed. Not today. I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the room, meeting the tense stares of the others. They were all on the edge, barely holding back the shift, waiting for something to push them over. I could feel their desire to fight, to let loose, but I didn't need to prove anything to them. Without another word, I turned, my footsteps echoing in the silence as I made my way out. I stepped out into the rain, the chill of the droplets against my skin, doing little to shake the storm brewing inside me. The rain didn't look like it was going to back down anytime soon. Its steady rhythm pounding against the streets, like nature itself, was intent on drowning out the chaos I'd just left behind. I glanced down at the rock still gripped tightly in my hand. The magic that had once pulsed within it had gone completely still, its energy shut down like a light flickering out. It was a dead end. I scanned the area, letting my eyes rake over the town, looking for any sign, any flicker of energy, any magical trace that would guide me to her. The witch. She had to be close. There was no way I had come all this way for nothing. I flexed my fingers around the rock, feeling the heat of my anger rise. No time for failure. I needed results. I took off then, using my vampiric speed. I blurred past the town, flashing in and out of alleyways, darting between buildings, disappearing only to reappear in different locations. But each time, it was the same. A dead end. No magic. No sign of her. I growled under my breath. Frustration gnawed at me, but I couldn't afford to lose my composure. Not yet. I stood at the far end of the town, near where I had last appeared. The rain whipped against me as I took in the scene. The town stretched behind me, its dim lights flickering in the downpour. But something caught my eye in the distance. It stood on its own, isolated from the rest of the town, tucked away at the edge of the woods. The faint glow from inside suggested someone was home, someone awake. The kind of peaceful, quiet existence that didn't quite fit with the rest of the town's energy. A small wooden house. Could that be it? Could that be where she was hiding? Witches didn't like to be around too many people. They sought solitude, a place where their magic wouldn't be drowned out by the noise of the world. A quiet, isolated house like that. It made sense. It could be her home. I didn't hesitate. I vanished. One moment I was standing at the edge of town, and the next, I was standing in front of the house. My feet barely touched the ground as I moved, my speed a blur in the night. I stood still for a moment listening, The rain drummed against the roof, but beyond that, the house was quiet. I felt it, a subtle pulse of energy radiating from within, faint but undeniable. This was it. Without another thought, I slipped through the shadows, moving toward the door. I stepped forward, my hand reaching out to push open the door, ready to enter as I would any other house. No invitations needed. But as my fingers touched the cool wood, something shifted. A sudden invisible force slammed into me like I'd just walked straight into a wall of pure energy. I froze, my body jolting backwards as the boundary repelled me with a fierce force, like the sun scorching my skin in an instant. The sensation was like nothing I'd ever felt before. The pain shot through me, burning from the tips of my fingers and searing into my chest. It was as though the very air around the house was alive, magic unlike anything I'd encountered before, and it wasn't about to let me through. I stumbled back, my feet sliding in the wet earth, my body refusing to obey me, as the force pushed me further away from the door. My chest heaved with the shock of it, the pain lingering, the heat still crawling under my skin. What the hell? I hissed under my breath, shaking off the disorienting sting. The magic was potent, far stronger than any ward I'd experienced. This wasn't just some simple spell to keep out intruders. This was deliberate. It felt like a warning, an unmistakable barrier that knew exactly what I was, what I represented. I gritted my teeth, standing tall despite the searing pain. Whatever this witch was, she knew exactly how to protect herself. She didn't need to say a word. The boundary spoke for her. The door creaked open, and I stood frozen, my eyes locked on it, waiting for the witch to step out. The seconds stretched on, but no one appeared. Just as the silence grew unbearable, a voice, low and smooth and unbothered from beneath me. "I'm right here." I looked down, and there, standing at my feet, was a short black man, no more than 4 feet tall, his dark eyes gleaming with an intensity that made me pause. He looked to be in his early 50s, his skin weathered but sharp. I blinked, confused. I thought the witch was a woman. I stared at him for a moment, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. The man didn't flinch under my gaze, his eyes unwavering as if he were the one in control here, which was the truth. This was his territory. "You're looking for the witch, I assume," he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking in its calmness. I narrowed my eyes. "I thought witches were women," I muttered, more to myself than to him. He chuckled a low sound that seemed to carry some hidden meaning. "Assumptions can be dangerous," he said, his grin never faltering. "Not all magic wears the shape you expect." I wasn't sure if I was more confused or intrigued. My focus sharpened, sensing something ancient, powerful, and completely unyielding about him. He might not be the witch I was expecting, but he knew something I needed to know. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice firm, though I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling in my gut. He tilted his head, considering me for a long moment, before replying with a cryptic smile. "A friend, if you're willing to accept it." I studied the short man, my patience wearing thin. A friend to the witch I'm looking for? Or something else entirely? I asked, my tone sharp, trying to gauge whether he was just toying with me. He met my gaze without hesitation. "I meant a friend to Jessica, the witch you're looking for," he replied, his words deliberate. Then his eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dangerous passing through them. And I can tell from the death lingering by that you're a vampire. Vampires are my worst enemies. He took a step closer, the tension thickening between us. Just meeting one like you makes me want to turn into a murderer. I didn't flinch, but I could feel the weight of his threat, and something about it made me want to retreat. But I couldn't. I had a purpose. I leaned in, voice low but firm. I'll leave. Just tell me where I can find her. The man's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly before he spoke again. She's dead, he said, the words heavy with finality. Vampires like you killed her. The air went still, and for a moment, I could barely process what he'd said. Jessica, the witch I had come here to find, was dead. The realization hit me like a hot punch, and the anger that surged through me was like wildfire. I could feel the grip of my emotions tightening. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I stood frozen, staring at the man, but after a moment, I snapped back to reality. Something wasn't right. My eyes flicked to him, watching as he turned, preparing to head back inside. Why do I feel like you're lying? I asked, my voice colder now, edged with suspicion. I can feel her energy around. She's not dead. The short man paused, his back still turned as if he hadn't heard me. But then, slowly, he turned back to face me, his expression darkening. As much as I wish that were true, he said, his voice low, it's not. Her energy is alive, beating through her daughter. A flicker of hope shot through me, despite the overwhelming weight of his words. Can I meet her daughter? The man's eyes hardened, his jaw clenched. So you can kill her too, like you did to her mother? His voice was laced with venom, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of something ancient and bitter in his gaze. Leave my grounds, vampire, or else you won't like what I do to you. The threat hung in the air, thick with tension. Every muscle in my body tensed, but I knew better than to let my rage guide me now. I couldn't afford whatever magic shit he held. Not yet. Not over this. Not when I was this close. I took a deep breath, my eyes narrowing. I'll leave for now. But you haven't heard the last of me. The man said nothing, but I saw the dangerous glint in his eyes before he turned and disappeared back inside the house. I stood there for a moment longer, my thoughts swirling, the anger still bubbling under the surface. Jessica's daughter. If she was alive, I had a new lead, and I wouldn't let anyone stand in my way. I rushed back, the tension in my chest building with every passing second. The air around me felt colder than it should have, prickling against my skin like a warning I didn't want to acknowledge. The cafe should have been right here. I stopped, staring at the empty lot in front of me, disbelief rooting me to the ground. The spot where I had left Keilah and the others was gone. Just a blank wall. This isn't right. I gritted my teeth, scanning the area, searching for any sign I had misremembered. But I hadn't. I knew exactly where the cafe had been. It was here. Keilah, I muttered under my breath, turning sharply toward the parking lot. Relief and unease collided as I spotted the car. I hurried to it, wrenching open the door to find her in the back seat, curled into herself, trembling violently. Her clothes were soaked through. One of the girls sat next to her. Keilah. I called her name, sliding into the driver's seat. I turned, looking back at her, my voice thick with urgency. What the hell happened? Are you hurt? She didn't look at me. Her teeth chattered as she hugged herself tighter. but her voice came out, shaking, weak, and laced with disbelief. Something unbelievable happened, she stammered, cutting me off before I could say anything else. Her eyes flickered to mine for just a moment before she motioned toward the wall across the lot. "Do you see that wall?" she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. I followed her gaze, my stomach twisting as I stared at the brick structure in the distance. "What about it?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, trying to piece together what was happening. "There was a cafe there," she said, the words spilling out in a shaky rush. Her hand trembled as she pointed. "The one you left me in. I ate, and then it disappeared." I went quiet for a moment, taking in her words, but the sight of her state, shivering in the back seat, was enough to make my jaw tighten. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin, soaked and chilling her to the bone. She hadn't rested since we left the underworld, and now this. Her exhaustion was catching up to her, fast. "We'll talk later," I said, cutting through the tense silence in the car. My voice was steady, even though my mind was anything but. "Right now, you need warmth and rest. I'm not having this conversation while you're like this." Keilah didn't argue. She didn't have the strength to. She just gave a small, shaky nod, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment, as her friend adjusted the jacket over her shoulders. I started the car, my grip on the wheel firm as I pulled out onto the streets. It wasn't long before I spotted a motel sign, flickering weakly in the distance. Relief surged through me as I pulled into the lot, parking the car near the entrance. "I'll get us rooms," I said, stepping out before anyone could respond. The warm air of the lobby hit me like a wave as I pushed the door open. A woman behind the counter looked up, her tired eyes meeting mine. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone matching her expression. "I need 4 rooms," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "If you have them." She shook her head, her mouth pressing into a thin line. "We're full. Sorry." A sharp pang of frustration shot through me. "Is there another motel nearby?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling about the answer. She didn't hesitate. "This is the only one in town. If we're full, that's it." I let out a low sigh, turning away from the desk and stepping back outside. The cold greeted me like an old enemy, biting into my skin as I leaned against the wall, staring out at the car. Keilah was still shivering, her head resting against the window now, eyes closed. She looked so small. The others, being vampires, would be fine. They can handle the cold. But her? She wasn't built for this. My teeth clenched as I realized I couldn't keep driving in circles. The town wasn't going to offer us anything else. Taking a deep breath, I made the only decision I could. I got back into the car, starting the engine once more. I parked the car in the narrow driveway leading up to the short man's house, the gravel crunching under the tires as I turned off the engine. The woods loomed around us, shadows stretching long and eerie. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Keilah stirred, her eyes fluttering open, still visibly weak from the cold. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice soft, but laced with confusion. I pushed open the driver's side door, stepping out into the freezing night air. "Somewhere you can get warmth," I said simply, closing the door behind me. The others followed suit, stepping out of the car without question. Keilah hesitated, then climbed out, pulling the damp jacket tighter around her shoulders. Her steps were unsteady as she moved closer, her brow furrowing as she watched me head toward the house. "Damien, wait!" she called, her voice trembling as she stepped in front of me, blocking my path. I stopped, looking down at her. "What is it?" I asked, my tone softer than I intended, her fragile state weighing heavily on me. She opened her mouth to speak, but the moment was cut short. The door to the house swung open with a sharp creak, and the short man stood in the doorway, his expression dark and brimming with hostility. His sharp eyes scanned over us before locking onto me. "I told you I don't want to see you here again," he growled, his hand lifting in a fluid motion. "Wait," I began, but the words barely left my mouth before a pulse of magic shot toward us, shimmering like a streak of lightning in the night. "Keilah, move!" I shouted, but it was too late. The ward slammed into her, hitting the ground with a force that made my stomach lurch.
Keilah's POV.
The moment the lighting magic struck me, it felt like I had been hit by a train made of pure energy. My body flew backwards, colliding with the ground with a force that knocked the breath clean out of me. A ringing filled my ears as I struggled to process what had just happened, my body trembling violently from the impact. For a moment, I couldn't tell up from down, the world around me spinning in a dizzying haze of cold and pain. When I finally managed to open my eyes, the first thing I saw was Damien rushing toward me, his face contorted with fury and worry. "Keilah!" he shouted, dropping to his knees beside me. His hands hovered over me, as if unsure where to touch, his panic barely restrained. "I'm fine," I croaked, though my body screamed otherwise. My vision blurred as I tried to sit up, only for Damien's hands to firmly press me back down. The memory of the short man standing in the doorway flickered in my mind, his sharp, hostile eyes burning into me. I turned my head weakly, and there he was, still standing there, his expression unreadable now. Damien's jaw clenched, the tension in his body so tight, I thought he might snap in two. But he didn't look at me. His gaze remained locked on the short man, his hands trembling as he fought to keep his composure. "She needs warmth," Damien said, his voice laced with barely restrained fury. "If you want to fight me, do it later, but right now, let me get her inside." The man didn't move for a long moment, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. Finally, with a sharp huff, he stepped aside, motioning toward the open doorway. "1 hour," he said, his tone clipped. "After that, you leave, or I'll make sure none of you ever walk out of here again." Damien didn't respond. He scooped me up in his arms, his movements gentle despite the storm of anger rolling off him. "I can walk," I muttered weakly, my pride flaring even as my body protested. "Not a chance," Damien said, his voice firm but low. The world tilted in and out of focus as Damien carried me toward the house, his arms steady, yet his movements tense. I felt the cold seep deeper into my skin with every step, making me shiver uncontrollably. The door to the house loomed closer, the light inside casting eerie shadows over the yard. When Damien stopped at the doorstep, I blinked up at him, trying to make sense of why he hesitated. He stood stiffly, his jaw clenched. "Invite me in," Damien said, his voice rough but controlled as he addressed the short man standing in the doorway. The man crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unchanged. "No," he said bluntly, his tone cold. "I don't invite vampires into my house." Confusion swirled in my mind. I forced my head up slightly, weak but curious. "You need an invitation?" I murmured, my voice barely audible. My brow furrowed as I looked at Damien. He'd never needed an invitation to enter my house. He didn't meet my gaze, his focus remaining locked down on the man in the doorway. "I do here," he muttered, his tone tight with frustration. "His magic is strong enough to keep me out without permission." The short man snorted a sharp sound that grated against my ears. "And that's exactly how I prefer it. Vampires are not welcome in my home," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "She can come in, for 1 hour, that's it. And only because I feel a shred of guilt for striking her with my magic that was meant for you." Damien's grip on me tightened slightly, and I could feel the tension radiating through his body. He ground his teeth audibly, his sharp canines flashing for a brief moment as he lowered his voice. "I can't trust you with her alone." The man's sharp eyes narrowed, his posture rigid and unyielding. "Then leave my yard," he said, his voice firm and final. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, both men unwilling to budge. Damien's jaw flexed, his sharp gaze locked on the short man who hadn't moved an inch from the doorway. The tension between them was suffocating, and I could feel Damien's frustration brewing like a storm ready to explode. I shifted weakly in his arms, mustering what little strength I had to speak. "Damien," I whispered, my voice hoarse and trembling. "Just take me back to the car. I'll be fine with the heater." His gaze snapped down to me, his eyes narrowing. "Keilah, you couldn't even keep warm in there earlier. Don't lie to me," he growled softly, his tone betraying his concern. I didn't argue because he was right. Even with the heater blasting, the chill clung to my bones like a curse. I briefly wondered if this was a side effect of eating at the Witch's Cafe earlier. But the thought of entering this man's house without Damien, or even Garby's friends, made my skin crawl. "I'll manage," I said weakly, though I didn't believe my words. Damien hesitated, his jaw tightening. Finally, with a low growl of irritation, he set me down carefully on my feet. "Go inside," he said, his voice sharp but laced with worry. "I'll wait out here. If anything happens, anything, you call me. Do you understand?" I nodded reluctantly, not missing the weight of his gaze as I turned toward the man who was now tapping his little foot impatiently. "Finally," the shorty man muttered as he stepped aside, his tone dripping with annoyance. I gave Damien one last glance, but before he could say anything else, the man slammed the door in his face. The sudden warmth of the house hit me like a wave, sinking into my skin and melting some of the icy numbness that had taken hold. I let out a small sigh of relief as my body started to feel more like mine again. But as I turned to follow the man further inside, my jaw dropped. The house, which had looked modest and almost cramped from the outside, was anything but. The room opened into an expansive space with vaulted ceilings, fussy furniture, and walls lined with shelves filled with glowing trinkets and books. It was as if I had stepped into a completely different dimension. I barely had time to process it when the man motioned toward the fireplace, the warmth from its roaring flames already beckoning me closer. "Sit there," he said curtly before turning and walking toward a staircase I hadn't noticed before. I blinked in shock. A second floor? How was that even possible, I thought, my jaw dropping again. It wasn't just the size of the house that startled me, but the seamless way it defied logic. Of course, I sighed inwardly as the realization settled in. He's a witch. Moments later, the man returned, holding a bundle of clothes. Without a word, he tossed them at me, the fabric hitting my chest before I caught them clumsily. "Change," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. I hesitated, clutching the clothes. "Here." The man rolled his eyes, clearly growing impatient. "No, there's a room down the hall. Use it." I glanced toward the hallway he pointed to, then back at him. Reluctantly, I nodded and started toward the room. As I stepped back into the main room, the warmth from the fire wrapped around me like a fluffy blanket. The clothes the man had tossed at me were simple but warm, and I felt like I could finally stop shivering. I turned my attention to him, seated in a chair that looked almost comically custom-made for his size. A thick book rested in his hands, and he was so engrossed in it that I wondered if he even noticed me standing there. Clearing my throat softly, I hesitated before speaking. "Thank you for letting me in," I began cautiously, glancing back toward the door. "But my friends are out there. They're cold too. Could you let them in? Just for a little while?" He didn't even look up. "They're vampires," he said, his tone flat and dismissive. "They'll be fine." I frowned, shifting my weight from one foot to the other. "Still, I'm worried about them." His gaze snapped up then, sharp and calculating. He studied me for what felt like an eternity, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to see through me. The silence was suffocating, and I suddenly felt like I'd said too much. Finally, he spoke, his voice laced with bitterness. "Vampires killed my friend," he said bluntly. "She did what they wanted, helped them, and they still killed her. Now it's the same vampires that want my help." I felt a pang of guilt, even though I had no idea who this friend was or what had happened. "Damien isn't the same," I said quickly, desperate to defend him. He's trying to stop. Stop, the man interrupted, his voice sharp as he leaned forward slightly. And how do you know him? His eyes bore into mine, pinning me in place. Is he your friend, your boyfriend, or your protector? The question hit me like a slap, leaving me fumbling for words. I hesitated, my mind racing. What was Damien to me? A protector? A friend? Something more? The weight of the man's gaze made my chest tighten as I realized I didn't know how to answer. The man's sharp voice snapped me out of my thoughts. Whatever he wants from me, I can only help him after knowing who he is to you. I froze, the weight of his words crashing down on me. My mind scrambled for an answer, my chest tightening with the urgency of the situation. Before I could think it through, the words tumbled out of my mouth. He's my boyfriend, I blurted, the lie tasting foreign on my tongue. The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze cutting through me like a blade. Slowly, he closed the book in his hands and set it down on the table beside him. Rising from his seat, he walked toward me, each step deliberate and heavy with purpose. Is he really your boyfriend? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Or are you just saying that to get what you want? My throat felt dry, but I nodded quickly. Yes, I said, forcing the word out with conviction I didn't feel. He is my boyfriend. His eyes bore into mine for another long, agonizing moment before he straightened, his expression unreadable. Fine, he said, turning toward the door. I will let them in, and I'll help him. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived as he added, but there's something I need in return. Anything, I replied too quickly, desperate to secure his cooperation. I want your uterus, he said, his voice smooth and almost casual, as though he'd just asked for a cup of tea. I stared at him, my heart hammering in my chest. Surely I'd misheard him. Surely he hadn't just said, "My price is your uterus," the man repeated, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. His calmness made it even more unsettling. My mouth opened and closed, words failing me. The room seemed to tilt for a moment, and I grabbed the back of a chair to steady myself. You can't be serious, I finally managed, my voice cracking. Oh, I'm very serious, he said, turning fully toward me now. His piercing eyes locked onto mine, unrelenting. What I want is not negotiable. You came to me, seeking warmth, seeking help for him. He gestured vaguely toward the door where I imagined Damien still standing, pacing and waiting for me. This is the price. Why? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Why would you ask for something so horrifying? The man's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. Because you'll pay it if you're desperate enough. And if you're lying about what he means to you, then this will end here. Your choice. I clenched my fists, anger bubbling beneath my fear. That's insane, I said, my voice firmer now. You're asking for something that isn't yours to take. This is my territory, my rules. I have no interest in bargains that cost me more than they're worth. I took a step back, my mind racing. Damien's face flashed in my thoughts, his sharp, determined features, the way his jaw tightened when he was concerned. I'd lied for him and for the girls, hoping to buy them safety, hoping to buy him a chance to get what he came here for. But this was too much. I need time, I said, my voice shaking slightly. There is no time, the man said coolly. Either agree or leave my house. I looked toward the door, torn. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but the memory of Damien waiting just outside kept me rooted to the spot. What if I say no? I asked, hating the way my voice wavered. Then they stay out there and I do nothing, he replied, unflinching. The choice is yours. My mind drifted, unbidden, to memories I rarely allowed myself to confront, the two children who had shaped and broken me in ways nothing else could. The first, lost too soon. A miscarriage that had left me hollow and grieving for a life that never got the chance to begin. The second, my miracle, my light, the little one who was nearly 4 now, growing with every passing day. But even his presence hadn't erased the sting of losing my first child. I had sworn then that I would never have more children. I couldn't. The pain of losing one, the fear of something happening to another, had cemented my decision. And especially not with Ralph. That chapter of my life was closed, sealed shut with regret and resentment. But the thought of walking around knowing I'd never have the option again made my stomach churn. It wasn't just about children. It was about the finality of it all, the permanence. Yet, as unsettling as the idea was, I thought of Damien. Damien, who had somehow become someone worth risking everything for. Not because he demanded it, not because I owed him, but because I cared. As a friend. Could I do this for him? My chest tightened as I made my decision. I turned to the man, my voice steadier than I expected. Fine, I said, the word feeling heavy on my tongue. I'll give it to you. His eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps in surprise at how quickly I had agreed, but I wasn't done. How will you take it? I asked, swallowing hard. Will it be painful? The short man stepped closer, his sharp eyes locking up onto mine with a glint of certainty. It will not be painful, he said flatly, his voice devoid of any comfort. Relief barely had a moment to settle in my chest before he continued. I'll use my magic, and it's happening now. My eyes widened in shock. I thought it would be done after. Not after, he interrupted sharply, his tone brooking no argument. Now, so follow me. He turned on his heel without waiting for a reply, his steps brisk as he led me down a narrow hallway into a curtained-off room. The space beyond was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Shelves lined the walls, packed with herbs of every shape and size. Candles in an array of colors flickered from scattered holders, their flames casting eerie shadows across the room. Odd contraptions filled every corner, things so strange and wired they defied explanation. As I stepped inside, a heaviness descended on me, settling like a fog over my mind. My head felt sluggish, my thoughts muddled. The man didn't seem to notice or care. With a wave of his hand, something shimmered into existence, a magical orb, glowing faintly as it opened like a safe. His hand still glowing, he turned to me. Before I could ask what was happening, he pressed his hands to my stomach. A warmth, almost soothing, radiated from his touch, and for a fleeting moment, I thought he had been honest about it not hurting. But then, as quickly as the warmth came, it was gone. He pulled his hands back slowly, his fingers cradled as if holding something fragile. My heart raced as I looked down. In his shimmering hands, something small and glowing rested, a faintly shimmering organ that pulsed faintly with life. Is that? I stammered my voice barely above a whisper, disbelief thick in every word. Is that my uterus? He ignored me completely, his focus solely on the glowing object in his hands. With the same precision and care, he turned to the magical safe and placed it inside, the shimmering light fading as he sealed it with another wave of his hand. The short man walked past me, his steps brisk and unbothered, as though nothing significant had just happened. I stood frozen, staring after him. I turned and followed him, my legs shaky as I moved. He reached the entrance, his hand already on the door handle when I called out, "Wait!" My voice cracked, but I forced myself to stand tall. "Whatever happened here? Don't tell Damien, please." The man stopped but didn't turn around. For a moment, I thought he might ignore me, but then, with a slow nod, he muttered, "As you wish," his tone neutral. He pulled the door open, the cold night air rushing in like a slap. Turning slightly, he spoke over his shoulder. "You all can come in." Just like a rush of wind, Damien was inside. His speed made my heart skip a beat as he dashed toward me, his eyes wide with alarm. His hands gripped my shoulders firmly, his face inches from mine as he searched for any sign of harm. "Keilah," he said, his voice urgent, his tone edged with worry. "Are you okay? Did he do anything to you?" For a moment, I could only stare at him, overwhelmed by his concern. His face was so sharp and intense. A soft smile crept onto my lips, surprising even myself. Gratefulness washed over me, not just for his worry, but for the constant, unwavering way he seemed to protect me. I didn't know if this affection came from genuine care or something deeper, something more complex. But it made me feel safe. It made me feel happy. Answer me, Keilah. Damien's voice rose, his brows drawing together in frustration. Did he hurt you in any way? I shook my head quickly, the warmth of his presence grounding me. No, I said firmly. I'm perfectly fine. He was telling me about how he can help you with finding the witch you told me you're looking for. I turned toward the short man, expecting him to confirm my words. Isn't that right, mister? The man's jaw tightened, his teeth gritting audibly as he spoke. The witch he's looking for is dead, he said coldly. I froze, my mind trying to process his words. Dead? Yes, he said coldly, his sharp eyes meeting mine. I told you earlier that the vampires killed her. I frowned, anger bubbling beneath the surface. But you didn't tell me it was the same witch Damien is looking for. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing, his silence cutting deeper than any retort. I stared down at the man, disbelief tightening my throat. My mind reeled, torn between the price I'd just paid and the revelation he'd casually dropped. He hadn't been clear, hadn't even hinted, that the witch he claimed was dead was the same one Damien was searching for. I wanted to grab him, shake him, and demand why he hadn't been more specific. But before I could say a word, Damien's voice cut through the storm of my thoughts. So are you telling me you're going to help me find her daughter? I turned my attention to Damien. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his expression calm, but I could see the tension in the way his jaw clenched. Yes, the short man replied, his tone clipped, businesslike. Whatever reason you have for wanting Jessica, her daughter can accomplish it. Damien narrowed his eyes, studying him as though trying to peel away layers of deceit. Are you sure about this? The man gave a single nod but added, It won't be easy, though. Hunting her down will be no simple task. Damien frowned, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. He opened his mouth to respond, but the man barreled ahead, cutting him off. She hates the existence of anything that breathes the air of the living, the man said, his voice dropping an octave as if to emphasize the danger. Jessica's daughter is unlike any witch you've encountered. She moves back and forth invisibly, leaving no trace behind. But I will use her mother's scent to locate her. The short man turned abruptly, his piercing gaze landing on Alan and the other guy who had driven them here. You two young men, he said, his voice carrying an air of finality, will spend the night by the fireplace. Your clothes will dry up there. Alan exchanged a glance with the other man, clearly not thrilled with the arrangement, but neither of them said a word. Next, he turned to the girls, Millie, Hustle, Tasha, and Maureen, all of whom were huddled together near the entrance. And you girls, he continued, gesturing toward a doorway to the right of the staircase, will spend the night in that room. You'll find dry clothes for each of you inside. Make yourselves comfortable, but don't touch anything that looks unfamiliar. The women exchanged uncertain glances, but they nodded, clearly too exhausted to argue. Finally, his attention snapped back to Damien and me. His eyes twinkled with something I couldn't quite place. Mischief, maybe? Or just satisfaction at making us squirm. And you two lovebirds, he said, his voice carrying a teasing edge, will share my room upstairs. What? I blurted, my cheeks burning. Damien's head whipped toward him, his expression hardening. We're not. Damien's point of view.
Before I could finish, Keilah moved faster than I anticipated, rising on her toes and slapping her hand over my mouth. The action caught me so off guard that I froze, my glare snapping at her. I'm so tired, she said with a laugh, so awkward it almost made me cringe. Let's just get some sleep. What the hell was she doing? I stared down at her, her hands still pressed against my mouth, as I tried to piece together this sudden display of whatever this was supposed to be. I pulled her hand away firmly, my brows furrowing. Keilah, I started. But before I could say more, the short man's voice interrupted. Do you guys have a problem? He asked, his beady eyes flicking between us. Keilah's response was immediate, her tone overly bright. "Not really," she chirped. Then she leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll explain." "Explain? About what?" Her words were quiet, but there was a weight in them that kept me from outright brushing her off. I studied her for a moment longer, trying to decipher the intent behind her expression. Whatever it wasn't random. After a beat, I nodded, reluctant but willing to play along. "For now." "Fine," I said under my breath, my voice low and controlled. Keilah's hand found mine, her grip light, almost hesitant. For a moment I debated pulling away, but something in her touch kept me still. With a quiet exhale, I let her hold on, following the short man up the creaking stairs. As we climbed, my mind raced with questions. What the hell was going on with her? What was so important that she'd stop me from speaking? And why was this witch called us lovebirds? The short man stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway, its hinges creaking as he pushed it open. His hand swept toward the small room inside, urging us to enter. I stepped in cautiously, my eyes scanning the cramped space. The walls pressed in closer than I liked, suffocating even though there was enough room to move. For someone used to wide open spaces, or no walls at all, it was unsettling. "Just sleep," the short man said, his sly grin catching my attention. His tone held a teasing lilt as he added, "And don't fuck in my sheets." I froze, my jaw tightening as I shot him a hard glare. Before I could say something I'd probably regret, Keilah's voice broke through the tension. "Nothing will happen," she said quickly, too quickly. "He'll be a good boy, as he always is." Her words made me whip my head toward her. A good boy? What the hell was she thinking? The short man smirked, clearly entertained. "Just so you know," he added, his voice dropping to an ominous tone, "the walls of this house have ears." He didn't wait for a reply and left, the door closing with a quiet click behind him. I stood there for a moment, my hands on my hips, staring at the closed door. Keilah's back was to me, but her movements drew my attention. She was retreating, backing away slowly with her head down like she was trying to avoid my gaze. "Keilah," I called sharply. She didn't respond, which only made my patience wear thinner. I reached out, grabbed her wrist, and turned her to face me. What the hell was that all about? Her head shot up, her face instantly going red. She stammered, But instead of continuing, her gaze darted to the door and then to the bed, like they held the answers she didn't want to give me. I exhaled heavily, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the bed, "and I will explain myself." I hesitated before sitting on the edge of the bed. She cleared her throat awkwardly before leaning in. Her breath was warm against my ear as she whispered, "I lied and said you're my boyfriend." I jerked my head back, staring at her in disbelief. "Why are you whispering?" I asked, my voice blunt. A knee-jerk reaction that made me hate myself for how stupid I sounded. Her face scrunched in mild irritation, and she reached up, her fingers brushing my chin as she urged my head closer again. Against my better judgment, I leaned in. "It was the only way," she whispered again, her voice so low it was almost inaudible. "The only way to bring you and everyone else inside. And of course," she hesitated, her eyes flicking to mine before continuing, "for him to help you get the witch you came here for." "Okay, I get it. But why the hell are you whispering?" She leaned in again, her breath warm against my ear. "Aren't you a fucking big-ass vampire? Didn't you catch his words? He just said the walls have ears, which means anything we talk about loudly, he'll probably hear, and that'll ruin the lie. If he hears us, you won't get any help from him, and we can't afford that." Her voice dropped lower, adding, "So don't disappoint me, King Draven." I stared at her for a moment. The way she was speaking, her tone so matter-of-fact, it was almost as if she was in control of this entire situation, even though I was the one who needed the help. She noticed my silent glare and added, "Your people hate it when I call you Damien." I didn't respond immediately, but her words struck a chord. Her attention shifted and she looked at the bed. "The bed is actually so big for a shorty man like him," she said, slipping under the covers with a soft huff. "Don't think of anything. Just sleep. You look exhausted." I sat there for a moment, thinking to myself. Sharing a bed with her again wasn't a problem in theory, especially since we were both exhausted. But her sleeping ability made me want to refuse. Still, I knew I couldn't ruin her effort to keep up the lie, especially if it meant the witch would be more likely to help me. I had to do this. I sighed, shedding my wet shirt. The fabric clung to me, cold and uncomfortable. But as I did, I caught the way she jolted. Her eyes went wide. "Why are you taking off your shirt?" she asked, clearly startled. I slipped my jeans off, turning to face her as she averted her gaze, muttering, "Just because I lied you're my boyfriend doesn't mean we have to." "Relax, Keilah. I can't sleep in wet clothes." I climbed into the bed, slipping under the covers. As I brushed my hand against hers, I felt her stiffen, her body pulling away slightly. I could almost hear her heart rate quicken as she tried to distance herself from me. I sighed, closing my eyes, forcing myself to calm down. "You need to relax, Keilah. I don't touch what's not mine." I awoke with a start, disoriented by the warmth pressing against my chest. My mind was slow to catch up, the remnants of sleep clouding my senses, but then it hit me. The unmistakable softness, the warmth of skin, and the weight of a body pressed against my own. Keilah, shirtless, was sprawled across me like she belonged there. Her breasts pressed against my chest, her leg thrown over mine, her breathing deep and steady as she snored softly. The sight alone was enough to send a wave of frustration rushing through me. "You've got to be fucking kidding." I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to stay calm as I carefully slid out from under her. Every move was calculated, quiet, slow, so I wouldn't wake her. The last thing I needed was her wide-eyed gaze meeting mine right now. My clothes were still damp, but I didn't care. Tugging them on with quiet efficiency, I forced my thoughts toward something else. The witch. There were bigger problems to deal with than waking up with Keilah's half-naked body plastered against me. Once dressed, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, but stopped cold. Something was wrong. Everyone was already up, all gathered in a single spot by the entrance. But as my gaze swept the room, something felt off. The space wasn't what it had been before. There was no staircase leading down. The room, the entire house, was flat. There was no sign of a fireplace, no trace of anything that had been here the night before. My instincts prickled. What the hell is going on? "King Draven," one of the girls said, getting my attention, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I think the witch messed with us. A spell or something. He made us see things that weren't real. And we can't leave this house. There's a barrier."
Hustle's point of view. The four of us, Millie, Tasha, Maureen, and I, sat huddled together on the bed, sighing in unison, each lost in our own thoughts but connected by a single dilemma: whether or not we should head upstairs to check on King Draven and Keilah. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Maureen muttered, breaking the silence. How did we even agree to come to the human world just to keep an eye on King Draven and his woman? Not just keeping an eye on them, I added with a wry smile. We're also supposed to stop them from sharing a room. Like that's even going to work. I'll go and make up an excuse to get Keilah to join us, Tasha said, heading toward the door. We all watched her in silence, none of us daring to speak. Just as she reached for the handle, she stopped abruptly, letting out a heavy sigh. I don't even have a heartbeat, but I can feel it racing, she muttered, turning back to face us. I can't do this. I stood up, brushing off the tension in the room. Let's admit it. This job Lord Seth gave us is nearly impossible. There's no way we can do this to our king. My suggestion? We go and confess to King Draven why we're really here, beg for his forgiveness, and head back to the underworld. The others exchanged uncertain glances as I continued. Honestly, there's nothing fascinating about this human world. All it's given us is a cold, drenching rain to remind us why we don't belong here. Maureen sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. You know what? I agree, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. This whole mission has been a disaster from the start, she said, rolling her eyes. Do you know what I hate most about the human world? Their ridiculous transportation, whatever they're called, they rattle and shake like they're falling apart. I thought I was going to lose what little dignity I have left when my stomach kept turning like I'd been cursed. Never again. Tasha gave her a side eye, raising an eyebrow. I'd say you were overreacting and it's called a car, but yeah, that was pretty awful. Still, it's not just the car for me. It's the noise. This world is so loud all the time. Cars honking, people shouting, those weird metallic boxes blasting music. It's like humans don't know how to enjoy silence. She shuddered. I can't imagine how they live like this every day. We all turned to Millie, the only one who had yet to share her experience in the human world. Her silence was deafening, and we couldn't help but stare, waiting for her to speak. Aren't you going to say anything? I asked, breaking the tension. Millie crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. No, I'm not saying anything. You're all too quick to judge. This world is a big one, and we haven't even explored it. All we've seen is this cramped, run-down small town. I raised an eyebrow, studying her carefully. There was something in her tone, something almost defensive. What is it? She asked. Why do you sound like you know so much about the human world? Have you been here before? Her gaze flicked to mine, her jaw tightening, but she didn't answer me. The room fell quiet for a moment. I shrugged, letting out a dry laugh, breaking the awkwardness. I guess Millie is right. We haven't explored it whole to judge, but let's be real. This assignment is a disaster. King Draven's not going to ever trust us after this. We're better off coming clean now than making things worse. Tasha exhaled and sat back down on the bed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. All right then, let's do it. We'll tell him everything, beg for forgiveness, and hope we don't get banished. Agreed, Maureen said, though her expression still betrayed her unease. Millie gave a hesitant nod. Fine, but we're doing it in the morning. I need at least one more night of pretending this disaster isn't happening. The bed wasn't nearly big enough for the four of us, but we had no other choice. Squeezing together, legs and arms awkwardly overlapping, we settled in as best as we could. The thin mattress groaned under our weight, and Tasha muttered something about humans not understanding comfort. Despite the cramped space, exhaustion eventually claimed us, and we drifted off into a restless sleep. I opened my eyes to the sound of something crashing to the floor. Blinking away the haze of sleep, I caught the faint noise of muttered curses. Slowly, I untangled myself from the girls and slipped off the bed, careful not to wake them. Creeping toward the door, I eased it open just enough to peek outside. In the dim light, I spotted a short man hunched over, hurriedly stuffing something into a small backpack. He looked up sharply, catching my gaze. A sly smile spread across his face. Oh, he said, his tone casual but laced with mischief. Didn't expect anyone to wake up this early, but since you did, you will be the one to tell the others. You're all to leave here at sunrise. With that, he slung the backpack over his shoulder, opened the door, and stepped out into the dark. The faint click of the door shutting made an echo in the house. My jaw dropped as I took in my surroundings, or what was left of them. The house was empty. The furniture, the fireplace, everything we'd seen before was gone. Even the staircase that had led upstairs was now a flat expanse of wall. I glanced toward the far corner of where the fireplace was. Alan and the other guy had sprawled out snoring softly. Whispering under my breath, I muttered, "Holy One, what is this? Everything's gone, just like that cafe the witch threw us out of." Spinning around, I darted back into the room, my heart pounding. Shaking the girls frantically, I hissed, "Wake up, wake up. You need to see this." Tasha groaned, rubbing her eyes. "What now?" "Just get up," I insisted, pulling at her arm. One by one, they scrambled to their feet, grumbling in confusion. Leading them out into the empty space, I gestured wildly. Look at this." As their eyes adjusted, the realization hit. The house was completely empty. Millie gasped, covering her mouth. Where did everything go?" Maureen spun in a slow circle, her face pale. This isn't possible. It was all here last night." Tasha, wide-eyed, shook her head in disbelief. "This can't be real," Maureen added, her eyes darting around the empty room. Millie stood in the center. "It's real," she said. "Everything's gone, just like that witch's magic in the cafe." The commotion roused Alan and the other guy, who sat up groggily, their faces twisted in confusion. "What's going on?" Alan asked, rubbing his eyes as he looked around the barren room. "Where is everything?" I stepped forward, my voice firm. "That short man from earlier, he said something about leaving at sunrise." Millie's eyes widened, and she interrupted. "That man is a witch. If he said that, it means we can't leave before sunrise. He must have manipulated our minds to make us see things that weren't real. Whatever his reasons were, they must have been important to him. He probably got what he wanted, released us from his spell, and disappeared." Alan frowned, standing up. "What are you saying? We can't leave here?" He strode toward the door, scoffing. "That's ridiculous." The moment he neared the door, an invisible force slammed into him, knocking him backwards with such intensity that he stumbled but managed to stay upright. He stared at the door, his eyes wide in shock. "It's true," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a barrier. We can't leave. We need to inform King Draven about this right away." He turned toward the room where King Draven was staying, but I quickly stepped in his way with a serious expression. "Wait, not yet. Let's think this through." Before I could finish, the door creaked open, revealing King Draven. His piercing eyes swept over the empty room, then to us. His presence was commanding as ever, his gaze sharp and intimidating. "What happened here?" he demanded, his voice low and steady but brimming with authority. I swallowed hard, stepping forward. "King Draven, I think the witch messed with us. A spell or something. He made us see things that weren't real. And we can't leave this house. There's a barrier." King Draven's expression darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line as his eyes flicked toward the door in a suffocating silence. The weight of his silence crushed down on me, making me feel smaller with each passing second. I dared a glance at the others, who were avoiding his gaze entirely. Alan opened his mouth as if to say something, but Millie grabbed his arm, silently warning him to stay quiet. King Draven stepped forward, his tall frame casting an imposing shadow. His fingers brushed the edge of the doorframe, and then he stopped. His nostrils flared slightly, and his expression shifted into one of cold calculation. For a moment, he remained still, his eyes narrowing as though he was analyzing something we couldn't see. "The barrier isn't natural," he said finally, his tone clipped. "It's layered with deception. The witch didn't just create a physical prison, he's masking something important." Millie spoke up, her voice trembling but steady. "He left in a hurry, my king. Whatever he wanted, he got it." King Draven turned his piercing gaze on her, making her shrink back slightly. "And what did he take?" "I don't know," she admitted. King Draven's gaze shifted sharply toward me, his icy eyes locking onto mine. I instinctively looked down, the weight of his stare pressing down on me like a heavy stone. My throat tightened, and I forced myself to stay composed. "Wake Keilah and bring her here," he commanded, his voice low and commanding. "She's human. She might be able to pass through this barrier." I nodded quickly, though the unease in my chest started to grow. I turned on my heels and walked toward the room. As I opened the door inside, I stopped dead in my tracks. The room was eerily silent. The bed, empty. I blinked, certain that I must have missed something. I stepped inside fully. I looked around the room, but Keilah was nowhere to be found. I turned back toward the door, panic rising in my chest. "King Draven," I called out, my voice shaking with the weight of the words. "Keilah isn't inside. She's gone." His reaction was instant, and his deep, harsh tone sent a shiver down my spine. "What the fuck are you saying? I just left her in bed, sleeping." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat growing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. There was no way she could have gotten up without anyone noticing, especially not in this strange, suffocating atmosphere. I hesitated, but then decided to go back inside, thinking that perhaps I hadn't seen properly because it was still dim inside. I scanned the room once more, but it was clear now. The space was empty, and there was no sign of her. She wasn't there.
Damien's point of view.
I've been pacing back and forth for what feels like hours, the frustration clawing at me with every step. Keilah is gone, and I know it's either that damned witch's doing, or she disappeared on her own. Wherever she is, only God knows. Tracking her this time won't be easy. It's going to be a hell of a lot harder. I've tried countless times to use my vampire powers to vanish through the air, but every attempt was futile. The barrier was impenetrable, which meant only one thing. That witch had secured the entire house with it. If I catch him, I swear I'll kill him. And after what felt like an eternity, the sun finally rose. I let out a frustrated sigh and smashed the door open. Of course, I passed right through, meaning the barrier had broken. The cars were still parked where they had been, but then, that scent, a familiar lingering trace of a werewolf. I tensed, my senses sharpening. There was movement, and out stepped the Alpha from the bar last night. "Hello there," he said, striding toward me with purpose. I met his gaze, my tone cold. "This isn't your bar. Be careful with your words." He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Of course, I'm not here to cause trouble. I was just curious who got caught in Joseph's traps this time. Didn't expect it to be you, though." I froze at his words. Does this scumbag know that dwarf witch? Without hesitation, I moved with lightning speed, my hand grabbing his collar, my teeth gritted in fury. "Are you working with that witch? Where is he?" The Alpha shoved my hands off him with a snarl, his eyes flashing with annoyance. He straightened his shirt, giving me a cold, calculating look before he spoke. "Be careful, bloodsucker," he warned. "I walk with half of my pack wherever I go." I couldn't care less. Like I give a fuck. I growled, my grip still tight in the air where his collar had been. "Now, tell me how you know the witch. I need to find him. There's a possibility he has a hand in." My words faltered for a moment as I wondered how to address Keilah in front of this Alpha. "One of my people," I finally finished, forcing the words past my lips. The Alpha's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing, as if he could see right through me. "Trust me when I tell you," he said, his voice softer now, though laced with a coldness of its own. "I don't know him that much, but I was once one of his victims. He did the same thing to me." The Alpha walked past me, his confident stride never faltering, as he headed toward the witch's house. I kept my eyes fixed on him, my mind racing with questions. The scent of more wolves lingered thick in the air. The Alpha, continuing his casual pace, glanced back over his shoulder. "Is the missing member of your group her?" he asked, his tone almost too casual. I didn't hesitate. "Yes, it's her." His face shifted, his expression suddenly more calculating. "I knew it," he muttered under his breath, then turned abruptly toward me. Exactly what he did to me. His eyes narrowed, as if piecing together some twisted puzzle. Let me guess. He offered her a chance to get in first without you. Then later, you got in, and he offered to help. What did he offer you? Magic spells? Magical blood? He waved his hands dramatically, as if it were some tired act he'd seen too many times. Anyway, whatever help you wanted, I don't care. But what you should know is that the witch made a deal with your girl member, and she agreed. Don't you want to know what kind of payment she gave to the witch? My patience snapped. I barreled at him, cutting him off mid-sentence, grabbing him with such force that I slightly lifted him off the ground. My voice was a growl as I demanded, "What are you trying to say?" Before he could respond, a sharp pain shot through my leg. I snarled, the jolt of pain nearly sending me to my knees. A wolf, small but fast, had sunk their teeth deep into my leg, drawing blood. The Alpha seized the opportunity, shoving me away with a surprising amount of force. "I told you," he said, his voice laced with annoyance. "I walk with half my pack. You didn't have to do that again." I turned to my people, who stood in a defensive formation, their fangs bared and claws ready. Their sharp gazes were fixed on the tree line, where a pack of wolves emerged, their snarls reverberating through the air in perfect harmony with the ferocity of my people. My grip tightened on the Alpha before me. I wasn't in the mood for this fight, far from it, but this bastard had brought it upon himself. My priority was finding that damned witch and getting the answers I needed. When I had what I wanted, I'd kill him without hesitation. But first, I had to get these dogs and their Alpha bitch out of my way. Behind us, the clash of fangs and claws grew more brutal, the sounds of snarls and yelps filling the air. My people were outnumbered, and I knew I couldn't leave them to fend for themselves. The Alpha smirked before shoving me away with a burst of force. His smug expression disappeared as his body shifted into his wolf form, and with a deafening snarl, he charged. His claws swiped at my chest, aiming to rip me apart. I sidestepped quickly, but not fast enough. His claws tore through my shirt, leaving a sharp sting as they scraped across my skin. Before I could recover, another wolf lunged at me from behind. Its teeth sank into my back, the searing pain fueling my fury. I twisted sharply, gripping its fury head with both hands. With a growl of my own, I whirled the wolf around with brute strength and hurled it to the ground with a bone-rattling thud. The Alpha charged again, his claws slicing through the air, but I met him head-on, countering his strike with a crushing blow that forced him to retreat slightly. His reaction didn't matter. I turned and plunged into the swarm of wolves, overwhelming my people. One by one, I fought them off, striking with precision and strength. I didn't kill, just delivered wounds deep enough to cripple, but not destroy, knowing they'd heal. Yet, no matter how many I brought down, they kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Let them. I would fight until they retreated. A sudden, powerful gust of wind tore through the chaos, carrying with it a cloud of dust that momentarily blinded everyone. I shielded my eyes, gritting my teeth as the fierce wind whipped around us. When the dust began to settle, a strange stillness blanketed the battleground. Every wolf froze in place, before one by one, they shifted back into their human forms. Without a word, they began retreating, helping their injured members rise before disappearing into the woods. The relentless snarls and growls gave way to an eerie silence. I turned, scanning the area for their Alpha, but he was gone. The wind died down just as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind only the sounds of my labored breathing and the rustling leaves. Then I saw her. In the shadowed edges of the woods, the red-haired woman from the bar stood watching me, her piercing gaze unmoving. She held my stare for only a moment, and I felt the hairs on my skin rise at the energy coming off her. And just like that, she vanished into the trees like a ghost. A cursing tone broke the silence, followed by one of the girls calling out, "I think she got a leg fracture." Her voice snapped my attention back to them. I moved toward them, and my gaze fell on one of the girls. Her leg was twisted, bent in a way that sent a sharp wave of anger through me. Through clenched teeth, she hissed, "Those motherfucking dogs. I hate them." I crouched beside her, examining the injury briefly before glancing around. "Are the rest of you okay?" I asked, my tone clipped. They all nodded, a mix of exhaustion and anger on their faces. "We're fine, King Draven," they muttered. I stood and turned to Adrien, who was holding his ribs but otherwise steady. "Take everyone back to Crimson Castle," I ordered. "Get someone to help her position her leg back. No delays." Adrien gave a curt nod. Understood. He immediately urged everyone to pile into the car, taking charge with efficiency. As they were getting in the car, I turned and made my way back into the witch's house. Once inside, I made my way to the room where Keilah and I had slept, searching the area for any clue that might lead me to her or the witch. I needed answers. Answers that could finally end this madness. As I stepped into the room, I froze, frustration building within me. The space felt almost empty. Just the bed, still rumpled, and the blouse Keilah had been wearing, likely discarded in the middle of the night. Had she disappeared, wandering off shirtless? The thought of her reappearing in strange places, her bare chest exposed, unsettled me to my core. I raked a hand through my hair, the weight of confusion and frustration crashing over me. It felt like I was losing my damn mind. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over me, sharp and heavy. It crashed through me like a tidal wave, stealing my control. My vision blurred, and I stumbled backwards, my legs giving way beneath me. I fought to keep my balance, but it felt impossible. Then a soft pair of hands gripped me, steadying my fall. For a split second, my mind stupidly, unwittingly, wondered if it could be Keilah, somehow here holding me together. But as I turned to face her, reality hit me like a blow to the gut. It wasn't Keilah. It was the red-haired woman. Her gray eyes were cold, her grip firm as she held me steady. My unsteady gaze narrowed at her, my mind struggling to piece together the situation. She tilted her head slightly, her voice icy as she spoke. "Don't look for her. She's where she belongs."
Keilah's POV.
My eyes fluttered open slowly, the haze of sleep still clouding my mind. A heavy, unfamiliar weight pressed down on my chest as I blinked, the world around me coming into focus. For a brief moment, I thought I was still with Damien, safe in the warmth of his presence. But then, I saw him. Ralph. My breath hitched, my body freezing as my gaze locked on his. Ralph. The one person I'd sworn never to face again. The one who... No, I couldn't think about it, but the memories came anyway, crashing over me like a violent storm. His betrayal, the pain, the utter devastation that had shattered me into pieces I thought I'd never be able to put back together. For the first time since being with Damien, all those buried emotions clawed their way to the surface, sharp and suffocating. My throat tightened as if invisible hands were squeezing the air out of me. It had to be a dream, Maybe Damien had some sort of side effect. Sharing a bed with a vampire king like him could mess with my head, right? I blinked rapidly, hoping against hope that Ralph would vanish, that I'd wake up from this nightmare. But he didn't disappear. He stood there, his face a mixture of shock and wary. And his eyes. Those eyes I'd once trusted more than anything stared back at me, wide and disbelieving. My mind reeled. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But he looked as stunned as I felt, his expression mirroring mine in a way that made my chest ache. "Ralph," I whispered, my voice barely audible as it trembled. His name felt foreign on my tongue, as if saying it out loud would solidify the nightmare. He didn't answer immediately. His lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, he just stared, his gaze darting over me like he was seeing a ghost. Confusion gripped me tighter. Was this still the dream? Or, because we were still mates, was this some strange connection? A reaction born of whatever cruel bond still tied us together? Ralph turned suddenly, his attention snapping to someone I hadn't noticed until now. Dahlia. She stood a short distance away, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. "How do you explain this?" Ralph's voice was hard, almost accusing as he spoke to her. "What did you do? How is she here?" Dahlia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She closed it again, her expression bewilderment. She looked utterly lost for words, as though she had no explanation for what was happening. A sudden cold shiver ran through me, and I hugged myself instinctively. My arms wrapped around my body, but the instant they did, my eyes snapped wide. Something was wrong. My gaze drifted down and my heart stopped. My chest was bare. My breasts were exposed. A rush of embarrassment and panic surged through me, and I scrambled to cover myself with my arms. My eyes darted around, taking in my surroundings for the first time. The forest. Trees loomed overhead, their bare branches stretching toward the sky. I wasn't just anywhere. I was on the grounds of the Moonrise Pack, in the middle of the woods. What in the heaven's name is happening? How did I end up in the Moonrise Pack territories, and why? I know I have some ability to disappear thanks to Damien's venom running in my veins that did the trick, but I hadn't wished to disappear. The last thing I remember is falling asleep beside Damien. And now here I am, in the woods, standing with Ralph, in his territory. I instinctively took a step back, desperate to put some distance between us, but Ralph moved quickly, grabbing my hand in a firm grip. "Stay," he ordered, his tone hard and commanding. The instant his skin touched mine, sparks raced through my body. Damn it all, those infuriating mate bond sparks. But my reaction was immediate and visceral. I jolted away from his grasp with such force that I lost my balance and fell to the ground trembling. Fear, pain, shock. Everything hit me all at once, overwhelming my senses. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to process any of it. All I felt was terrified. Then my eyes caught something. I looked down and saw where I'd been standing. The realization sent a chill through me. I was in the center of a circle, surrounded by candles that had burned low. And in the center of the circle, lying on the ground, was my dress. Slowly, I turned my gaze upward, locking eyes with Dahlia. She was standing a few feet away, looking back at me. It hit me then. She was a witch. Of course, it had to be her doing. All of this made sense if she'd used magic to drag me here. As if reading my thoughts, Dahlia shook her head quickly, her expression tightening. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice slightly strained. "I didn't do anything to make you appear here. We were just trying to get Alpha's wolf back because you're still his mate. I had to use your dress to lure his wolf here, but instead of his wolf, you appeared." Her words sent another shiver through me, the cold morning air biting against my bare skin. I wrapped my arms around myself instinctively, trying to stave off the chill. Ralph noticed immediately. His sharp gaze flicked to the dress on the ground. Without a word, he bent down, picked it up, and tossed it toward me. "Get dressed," he said curtly, his tone hard. "You're here physically now, that's good. You'll be of more use than your clothes." He glanced over at Dahlia with a raised brow. Isn't that right? Dahlia nodded hesitantly, her lips pressing into a thin line as she avoided my gaze. I pulled the dress over my bare skin quickly, rising to my feet with a newfound determination. I need to leave, I said, my voice firm even as it trembled slightly. Damien must be looking for me. I didn't make it far. Ralph was suddenly in front of me, blocking my path. His eyes were stormy, his jaw set in a hard line. "Who the fuck did you say?" he asked, his voice a harsh whisper filled with barely restrained anger. "Damien," I replied, trying to shove past him. But this time, his hand shot out, gripping my wrist tightly. His hold wasn't just firm, it was possessive. Ralph's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding audibly as his fury bubbled to the surface. In one swift motion, he yanked me closer, his face inches from mine. "Did you break up with me for the vampire?" he growled, his tone venomous. "Was our son's death just an excuse for you to leave me because you were tired of me?" I froze at his words, the weight of them crashing into me like a tidal wave. Ralph had always been harsh, cold even, but this? I couldn't believe he was the one to say it, to bring up our son like this. It felt like a blade had been driven straight into my chest, twisting with each syllable. I swallowed hard, forcing the knot in my throat down and turned away, willing myself to walk past him, but before I could take another step, his hand shot out again, gripping my wrist with enough force to send sparks flying up my arm. "Let me go," I whispered, my voice barely audible as my heart began to race. "No," he said firmly, dragging me a step closer, his gaze boring into mine. "Answer me, Keilah. Did you leave me for him? Did you—" "Stop!" I cut him off, my voice breaking under the weight of his accusations. My chest tightened painfully and I felt the ache spreading, seeping into every fiber of my being. The air around me seemed too thin, and I couldn't catch my breath. I brought a trembling hand to my chest, clutching it tightly, desperate to ground myself. My vision blurred, spots of black dancing on the edges as panic clawed at me. The suffocating weight of his words, the grief they unearthed, and the raw pain of everything I had tried to bury crashed into me all at once. My knees buckled slightly and I swayed, gasping for air as if the world had suddenly decided there wasn't enough oxygen for me. "Keilah," Ralph's tone shifted slightly, the anger in his voice laced now with something that sounded almost like concern. But I couldn't focus on him, couldn't hear him clearly. All I felt was the relentless ache in my chest and the desperate, suffocating need to escape. I didn't know what was happening, but suddenly every painful memory came rushing back like a movie set on fast forward, playing at twice the speed, each scene more unbearable than the last. It started with the first time I came to the pack house, where Ralph subjected me to unspeakable physical and mental torment. The memory shifted to where I was being attacked by his pack members, wolves whose hatred burned through me as they clawed and struck, their growls echoing in my ears. They nearly killed me that day, leaving me broken and bleeding, barely able to crawl away. Then came Zach. The memory hit like a punch to the gut, just as his fist had that horrible day slamming into my stomach, causing me to miscarry my child. I felt the agony all over again, the sharp, ripping pain in my stomach as I crumpled to the ground. The painful flashbacks kept coming, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Our endless fights and misunderstandings that we couldn't resolve. And then, the worst memory of all, the one no amount of time could ever erase. My son. My sweet, innocent baby, Evan. He was ripped away from me not by fate, but by cruelty. His father's people accused him of being born of a human mother and of being unworthy of a place in their society. I could see it so clearly, their claws, their snarls, the blood. I screamed, begged, and fought, but I couldn't stop them. Evan's tiny body fell limp in my arms, his warmth fading as I cradled him close. His little hand reached up to touch my face, his voice barely a whisper as he said, "I'm very sleepy, Mama." And then, he was gone. The ache in my chest was unbearable, the pain so sharp it felt like I was being torn apart. I gasped for air, clutching at my heart as if I could somehow hold the pieces together. I jolted awake, my chest heaving as I gasped for air, the sharp pain still echoing in my heart. My throat felt raw, and tears streamed down my cheeks, hot and unrelenting. It was as though the memories had ripped through me all over again, leaving me shattered, their cruel aftermath lingering even in wakefulness. Blinking rapidly, I looked around, my vision blurry. The room came into focus, familiar yet foreign. The walls, the faint scent of musk, the large bed beneath me. It was Ralph's room, or what had once been ours. The realization sent a wave of dread coursing through me. And then I saw him. Ralph. He stood near the edge of the room, his piercing gaze locked onto me. His presence filled the space, his expression unreadable, a mask of calm over the storm that I could sense brewing underneath. My heart began to race uncontrollably at the sight of him, not out of longing or affection, but fear and the weight of everything he represented. I couldn't form words. I didn't know if I even wanted to. The tears that continued to flow down my face said everything I couldn't bring myself to voice. Ralph's jaw tightened as he watched me, his silence heavy and charged. After a moment, he moved, grabbing the single sofa by the window and dragging it across the floor. The sound grated against my ears, but I didn't flinch. He placed it at the side of the bed, positioning it directly in front of me. Then, with an air of authority, he sat down, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "Let's talk," he said, his tone steady but devoid of warmth. The words hung in the air, and for a moment I could only stare at him, my breath hitching. What could I possibly say to him? To the man who had torn me apart and yet still sat there, as if this was some conversation that could mend the irreparable? But his gaze didn't waver. If anything, it seemed more intense now, as though he were daring me to speak, to unleash the torrent of emotions swirling within me. My trembling hands clutched the blanket tightly, pulling it closer to me as if it could shield me from the weight of his presence. Still, I couldn't find my voice. My chest ached, and the sobs threatened to spill over again. The memories were too fresh, too raw. Ralph remained seated, unflinching, waiting for me to say something. But all I could do was sit there, lost in the chaos of my pain, the wounds that had never truly healed. Ralph leaned back slightly, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed intently on me. His voice was calm and deep, yet carried an edge I couldn't quite place. "Have you always been like this?" he asked, his tone unsettlingly neutral. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I simply stared at him, unsure of what to say, unwilling to give him anything. My silence seemed to annoy him, but he didn't snap. Instead, he let out a hard sniff, his jaw tightening momentarily before he spoke again. "All right," he said, his voice still calm but slightly more pointed. "If you can't answer that, then tell me this. Was I wrong? Did you break up with me for Damien?" He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And how long had it been going on? How long have you felt for him? I remember his mark disappeared from your neck, but now..." His eyes flicked toward my neck, and I instinctively brought my hand up to cover it. "From what I saw, he marked you again." His words hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. He raked a hand through his messy hair, his frustration evident, even though he tried to hide it. "Have you two slept together?" he asked, his voice lower, almost a growl. That was it. I had had enough. Wiping the tears from my face, I pushed myself forward, swinging my legs off the bed and planting my feet firmly on the floor. My hands gripped the edge of the mattress for stability as I leaned slightly toward him, my eyes meeting his with defiance. "Why do you care so much?" I asked, my voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. "You and I have nothing anymore, Ralph. Nothing. So what gives you the right to sit here and ask me these stupid, childish questions?" For a moment, I thought he might lose his composure. His jaw clenched, the muscles in his face tightening as though he was about to explode. But instead of snapping, he surprised me. He remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "Did you just call them childish questions?" he asked, his voice low and measured, his composure unnerving. He let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head slightly. "Fine, I'll accept that. Now answer me." I stared at him, the weight of his demand pressing down on me. I knew he wouldn't back down, wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. My mind raced, searching for a way out. Then, I made a decision. Yes, I lied, my voice steady, despite the turmoil raging inside me. Yes, I broke up with you for Damien. I've felt for him for a long time, longer than I care to admit. And yes, we've slept together. Are you happy now? The words tasted bitter, but I forced them out, watching as they struck him like a physical blow. His face remained composed, but his eyes betrayed him. A storm brewed within them, his emotions raw and unfiltered. But he didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stared at me, his silence heavier than any words could have been. I straightened my back, my tone cold and distant as I spoke. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to leave. I have no place here anymore, Ralph. And please, my voice broke slightly, but I steadied it with a deep breath. This, I beg of you. Don't ever bring our son into this again. I pushed myself off the bed, my body tense, as I moved toward the door, determined to leave this place and everything it represented. But before I could take another step, Ralph was suddenly on his feet. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm with a grip that stopped me in my tracks. Ralph, I began, but my words were cut off as he turned and pushed me back onto the bed with enough force to make me gasp. Before I could react, he pinned me down, his weight pressing me into the mattress. His hands gripped my wrists, holding them above my head as his eyes burned into mine with an intensity that made my heart pound. You're not leaving, he said, his voice low and resolute. Not yet. I struggled against him, my body writhing in an attempt to break free, but he didn't budge. Let me go, Ralph, I hissed, glaring up at him. You have no right. I will let you leave, he interrupted, his voice firm but surprisingly controlled. But not until I get my wolf back. I opened my mouth, ready to tell him about his wolf, that it was in the underworld and that maybe we could find a solution, perhaps even go there to reunite him with it. But then I hesitated, the thought of his reaction stopping me cold. If he found out I had been to the underworld too, it might only make him more volatile. So, I swallowed my words and stayed silent. Ralph leaned in, his face so close I could feel the heat of his breath. To reclaim my wolf, you have to mate with me, he said, his tone steady but laced with a chilling resolve. It's the only viable option aside from using something of yours like your clothes. My eyes widened in shock and disbelief. Are you out of your mind? I spat, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. That's not happening. You have to cooperate, he said, ignoring my protests. Because I don't want to use force, Keilah, but I will if I have to. The weight of his words crushed me, leaving me speechless for a moment. I stared up at him, my chest rising and falling rapidly as my mind raced. Was he serious? Did he truly expect me to agree to this? And then what? I demanded, my voice shaking but defiant. You'll just let me go after that? Yes, he replied, his tone unwavering. Once it's done, you can leave. I won't stop you.
Damien's point of view.
I pried her hands off me and fixed her with a hard stare. What do you mean? Are you talking about Keilah? Yes, she replied, her tone sharp. I'm talking about her. She's where she belongs, with her wolfmate. You two aren't supposed to stick together. Her words set my blood on fire. I grabbed her by the hair, yanked her up, and pinned her against the wall. My voice was a low growl as I demanded, How do you know Keilah went to Ralph? She glared at me, her gray eyes glowing ominously. I froze. A fae. This bitch was fae. I let her go abruptly, stepping back. She straightened her clothes with deliberate calm and turned her gaze on me. I can take you to the witch you're looking for, she said coolly. I narrowed my eyes. How do you know where he is? She smirked. Didn't you just figure out what I am? Then lead the way. What are you waiting for? I barked. She tilted her head, her smirk fading. I will, but only after you promise me one thing. You will stay away from Keilah. I ran a hand through my hair, frustration boiling over. Why the hell are you so concerned about Keilah? I snapped. Her expression didn't waver. I sighed. the tension in my chest coiling tighter. "Look," I began. "I can't make that promise, without a damn good reason. But if it's the only way to find that dwarf witch, then fine. I'll stay away. But only after I've seen her with my own eyes. I need to know she's safe and unharmed." She studied me for a long, silent moment, as though weighing my words. Finally, she nodded. "Fine. But remember," her voice sharpened, "a promise is a promise. If you break it, you won't like the consequences." I exhaled sharply, narrowing my eyes at her. "Fine. Lead the way." Without a word, she turned and walked toward the door. I followed, my steps heavy with frustration. As we stepped out of the witch's house, my gaze immediately locked onto a figure leaning casually against the car. "Alan, why didn't you leave with the rest?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "I thought I might be of some help," he replied. "Help, huh?" I muttered, not entirely sure how I felt about his presence. I motioned toward the car. "Get in." The Fae didn't wait for an invitation. She slid into the back seat, her expression unreadable. Alan hesitated for a second, then opened the passenger door and climbed in. The journey was long and silent, the tension in the car thick enough to cut. The Fae's voice would occasionally break the quiet, directing me to take sharp turns or long stretches down winding roads. Finally, she spoke again. "Stop here." I glanced out at the road ahead, empty and stretching into the distance. There was nothing but trees and shadows surrounding us. "Here?" "Yes," she replied firmly. I killed the engine and stepped out, Alan following my lead. The Fae was already moving, heading toward the dense forest on the roadside. We entered the forest, the dense canopy above filtering out what little light there was. It was a short walk before the Fae stopped abruptly. She raised her hand, and to my shock, it disappeared into what seemed to be an invisible barrier before stepping through. I reached out cautiously, my fingers meeting an unseen resistance. With a deep breath, I pushed through, the sensation oddly tingling against my skin. On the other side, the woods opened up to reveal a hidden village. I glanced behind me and felt Alan's presence close by. He stepped through the barrier, his eyes darting around with surprised eyes. The Fae turned, her expression unreadable. "Follow me." Without waiting for a response, she began walking down the narrow path leading into the heart of the village. The village was unnervingly silent, not a single sound to disturb the stillness, as if the place existed outside the realm of life itself. Shadows stretched across the multiple stone-built houses, with grass-thatched roofs, lending an eerie air to the surroundings. The Fae led the way, her movements fluid and deliberate, until she stopped in front of one of the houses. She turned to me, her expression as unreadable as ever. "He's in there," she said, her voice calm, motioning towards the closed wooden door. "You sure?" I asked, narrowing my eyes at her. She didn't respond, simply stepping aside, her glowing presence radiating quiet authority. As I brushed past her, she added softly, "You don't need an invitation." That was all I needed. With a powerful kick, I sent the door crashing open, splinters flying as it slammed against the wall. My eyes immediately locked on him, the dwarf witch. He was seated on a large brown fabric, a young woman beside him. 2 candles flanked her on either side, their faint light casting flickering shadows across the room. Both of them looked up sharply, startled. His mismatched eyes widened in recognition, and I saw the first flicker of panic cross his face. Before he could so much as utter a word, I was on him. I grabbed him by the collar, yanking him off the ground with a single motion. His feet dangled uselessly as I hoisted him into the air, his face mere inches from mine. "Why the fuck did you lie to me?" I growled, my voice low and cold, vibrating with fury. "Why did you play with us? If you weren't going to help, you could have just said so." My grip tightened as fury coursed through me, and I could feel his labored breaths struggling against the pressure of my hand. His face turned a shade paler, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he was too shocked by my sudden appearance to retaliate with the magic I knew he possessed. The magic that could easily end my existence if he chose to use it. Whatever the reason, I wasn't letting go until I got the answers I came for. My grip on him tightened as his face turned an unhealthy shade of red, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. For a moment, the Alpha's words echoed in my mind, the ones he'd blabbered about Keilah making a deal. I clenched my jaw, trying to push the thought away. As a dick of an Alpha, he is always stirring up trouble. Maybe it was just another one of his games. But the doubt lingered. "What did you take from Keilah?" I finally demanded, my voice low and dangerous. The words dripped with venom as I stared into his mismatched eyes. "What did she promise you that made you accept her plea for help?" The witch's lips twitched, his voice raspy as he croaked out, "I was going to come back." I cut him off with a savage snarl, my voice rising like a thunderstorm. "What did she promise you?" He stilled, his eyes darting to the young woman sitting silently on the brown fabric. For a moment, the room was deathly quiet. Then, with a flicker of something almost triumphant in his gaze, he rasped, "I've already taken it." A chill shot down my spine, and my grip instinctively tightened, the wood beneath my boots creaking under the force of my rage. "Whatever it is," I snarled through gritted teeth. "Tell me." The witch hesitated, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. Then, with an eerie calmness, he met my gaze and said, "She paid with her uterus." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. For a brief, frozen moment, I could only stare at him, the weight of his revelation crashing over me hardly. My mind raced, fragments of images of Keilah flashing before my eyes. The idea of her making such a sacrifice, I couldn't process it. Rage boiled to the surface, consuming me in an instant. My vision blurred, red clouding my entire being. "You bastard!" I roared, my grip tightening so hard that his face turned purple. He choked and clawed at my hand, but I didn't let go. My anger demanded an outlet, and he was going to pay for what he'd done. Before I could ask the question burning in my mind, why? A sudden searing force slammed into me from the side. It was like being hit by a hurricane, the magic crackling with raw power as it sent me flying across the room. I hit the wall with a bone-rattling crash, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. Splinters rained down around me as I slumped to the floor, dazed but alive. The young woman stood now, her hand outstretched, her eyes blazing with magic. The air around her shimmered, charged with energy, as if the very fabric of the room bent to her will. I pushed myself up, fury coursing through my veins. The room crackled with the heat of my rage, the air thick and suffocating as my magic flared, pushing against the walls like a living thing. I barely registered the wreckage around me. Only the dwarf mattered. My eyes locked onto him, scrambling backwards, his stubby fingers grasping at the empty air, as if he could claw his way out of this. I was done playing games. The power surged within me raw and untamed, begging to be released. I raised my hand, the energy coursing through my veins, ready to tear him apart, to let him taste the bitterness of my magic, to let him understand what it felt like to be at the mercy of someone stronger. But just as I let it go, she stepped in the way. The young woman. Why the hell would she interfere? My magic met her shield with a crackling roar, the impact shaking the room. She stood firm, her hands outstretched, her face etched with determination. I barked a warning. Move. She didn't. My power tore through her shield like paper, the force sending her flying across the room. Her body slammed into the wall, the sound of the impact echoing in the small space before she crumpled to the floor. My jaw tightened as I turned back to the dwarf. He was next. I barely took a step when his voice rang out, frantic and high-pitched. Stop! The woman you just blasted, she's the witch's daughter you're looking for. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, freezing me in place. My breath came in sharp, controlled bursts, my gaze snapping to the unconscious figure sprawled on the floor. I didn't want to believe him. It had to be another trick, another lie. The bastard was desperate, and desperate men said anything to save their skin. But something about the way he said it, the crack in his voice, the way his eyes darted between me and her, made me pause. What did you just say? I demanded, my voice like the edge of a blade. My magic pulsed around me, still coiled and ready to strike, but now held in check by a thread of restraint. The dwarf swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, as he pointed a trembling finger at her. She's the one. Jessica's daughter, I swear it. Why the hell didn't you tell me this last night? My voice was low, dangerous. You knew where the witch's daughter was, and you said otherwise. The dwarf hesitated, his eyes flickering with guilt or maybe calculation. I had my reasons. Reasons, I repeated, my lip curling. Were you working with her? Luring people into your traps and mind-playing them to your advantage? He let out a strained laugh, one that grated on my nerves. Something like that, yes. Now, can you help me carry her? You'll need her alive, won't you? I raked a hand through my hair, biting back the urge to throttle him then and there. This guy is not fucking serious, I muttered under my breath. Alan, I barked. He rushed forward, his movements swift and precise as he knelt beside the woman. Gently, he lifted her, cradling her like she was something fragile, something worth protecting. He turned to me, awaiting my next command. Carry her. She's coming with us, I ordered, my tone leaving no room for argument. The dwarf's head snapped toward me, his beady eyes narrowing. What? Exactly what I said, I growled. You and her are coming with me. You're going to return what you took from Keilah. The dwarf let out a nervous chuckle, then quickly shook his head. That's a problem, he said, his voice tinged with false regret. I already used it. My fists clenched at his admission, but he wasn't done. Your girlfriend, having Fey blood in her, made her the perfect candidate for what we needed. Fey blood? His words slammed into me like a freight train. I frowned, the weight of his revelation pressing down on me like a stone in my gut. The dwarf's smirk widened, his smugness crawling under my skin. That reaction says it all. You didn't know, did you? Your girlfriend is Fey. How long have you two been together that a powerful vampire like you didn't notice? I stared at him, my mind racing. His words were meant to rattle me, and damn it, they did. If what he was saying was true, Keilah was Fey. And I hadn't known. The implications hit hard and fast, but there was no time to unravel them. My focus sharpened on the dwarf, my magic pulsing dangerously again. Whatever you did to her, I I said through gritted teeth. You're going to undo it. His smirk faltered slightly, but he held his ground. Undoing it won't be easy, or possible. You should have asked her what she was willing to sacrifice before pointing fingers at me. I took a step closer, my voice cold and deadly. And you should have prayed to whatever gods you believe in before taking anything from her. Because now, you've made it my problem. Alan adjusted the unconscious woman over his shoulder as we stepped out of the dim, oppressive house. The dwarf shuffled ahead of him, keeping a wary eye on me, clearly aware of the razor-thin edge of my patience. My gaze burned into his back, but my thoughts weren't just on him. Keilah. Her name echoed in my mind, louder than anything else. As we stepped out of the house, my eyes immediately landed on the Fae. She stood near the edge of the pathway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Did you know Keilah was Fae? I asked, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the silence. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, she spoke with calm detachment. Don't forget the promise you made. My jaw tightened. You didn't answer my question, I said through gritted teeth. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. That is none of your concern. I exhaled heavily, blowing out a breath that was part frustration, part exhaustion. My eyes flicked around the village, taking in the unnervingly still surroundings. Everything was too quiet, too green. Even the vibrant grass and towering trees seemed unnatural, their perfection grating against my nerves. This place didn't feel like it belonged in the real world, and I was eager to leave it behind. We pushed past the barrier, its faint shimmer breaking apart as we crossed into the forest. The car waited exactly where we'd left it, untouched, its black surface gleaming dully under the filtered sunlight that managed to pierce through the trees. I opened the door, motioning for Alan to put her in the back seat. The Fae approached, her steps silent but deliberate. She stopped short of the car, her ethereal presence commanding attention. You go ahead, she said, her voice smooth and unyielding. I'll take myself. I didn't bother responding. My mind was already racing ahead to the Moonrise Pack, to Keilah. I needed to see her, needed to confirm she was okay. Sliding into the driver's seat, I glanced back briefly. Alan was settling in, his jaw set as he secured the woman in place. The dwarf sat beside her, looking small and uncomfortable. Without another word, I started the engine, the car rumbling to life. The Fae stood motionless as we pulled away, her figure fading into the forest. I parked the car across the road from the Moonrise Pack's borders. My grip on the wheel tightened as my eyes flicked to the tree line. I shifted my gaze to the back seat. The dwarf stared back at me, his beady eyes filled with unease. Next to him, the witch's daughter lay still, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Relief warred with frustration in my chest. She was alive, but for how long? I'll be back in a short while, I said, my voice cold and steady. I hope everyone stays intact. I hope you don't keep us waiting, he retorted, his tone edged with subtle challenge. I ignored him, stepping out without a backward glance. I drew on my magic, chanting under my breath. A faint shimmer of energy pulsed through me as the masking spell took hold. My scent would be invisible to any wolf out there. Without hesitation, I launched myself into the air, the wind slicing past me as I sped through the sky. My focus was razor sharp, every thought centered on Keilah. I needed to confirm with my own eyes that she was okay and safe, but my emotions were saying otherwise. She was hurting. The Moonrise Pack's house spread out beneath me, a sprawling expanse of forest and hills. I landed at the base of the woods, my boots crunching softly against the earth. The area was eerily quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves and the distant movement of patrolling wolves. I scanned the area, my eyes searching for her, but she wasn't here. My jaw clenched, frustration building as I tried to push back the unsettling feeling gnawing at me. Steeling myself, I moved toward the main entrance of the pack house. The towering structure loomed ahead, its lights glowing faintly in the darkness. I approached the door, my steps swift, and knocked hard, the sound reverberating through the still night. The door creaked open, revealing a woman. Her gaze locked onto me, and in an instant, she shifted, her body morphing as a warning growl rumbled from her throat. I rolled my eyes. "I'm not here for that," I said sharply, my patience already stretched thin. Before I could continue, movement caught my attention. My eyes snapped to the staircase inside, where Ralph descended with slow, deliberate steps. His presence filled the space, his power radiating even from a distance. We stared at each other, the tension between us palpable. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. The way his eyes burned into mine told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't pleased to see me. I didn't care. "Where is she?" I demanded, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. Ralph descended the stairs with swift, deliberate strides, his every movement radiating tension. Whether he intended to slam the door in my face or start a fight, I braced myself, ready for whatever came next. But then, he suddenly stopped halfway down and turned, his attention snapping to the top of the staircase where her voice, soft yet strained, echoed through the air. "Damien," Keilah called, her voice carrying a mix of desperation and longing. I followed Ralph's gaze, and there she was, standing at the top of the stairs. My chest tightened painfully, and my body tensed as I took her in. She looked pale, too pale, her face drawn and her eyes swollen, evidence of hours spent crying. I clenched my fists, my gaze shifting coldly back to Ralph. He or his people were the reason for her tears. I was certain of it. He hurt her over and over again, always pushing her to the edge. This time, it was too much. It wasn't just her pain tearing at me. It was breaking me. Keilah suddenly began descending the stairs, her movements hurried and unsteady. As she passed Ralph, her shoulder knocked him slightly off balance, but she didn't stop. "Keilah," I snapped, my voice sharp and instinctive. "How many times do I have to tell you not to run on the stairs?" She didn't even glance my way, her focus on reaching me. I opened my mouth to add, "You'll fall," but the words barely left my lips before her foot caught the edge of a step. She tripped, her body lurching forward. "Keilah!" Both Ralph and I shouted at the same time, but as I lunged to help her, a force like a battering ram hit me square in the chest. It sent me flying backwards, the impact stealing the air from my lungs, but I steadied myself upright, and before I could move, Keilah was already on her feet. She sobbed openly now, her cries raw and unrestrained, and my stomach twisted at the sound. I opened my mouth to scold her for her recklessness, but the words froze in my throat as she ran toward me. Without hesitation, she threw herself into my arms, wrapping them tightly around me. Her sobs shook her body as she buried her face against my chest, and then, through the tears, she whispered the words that made the world stop spinning. "I missed you, Damien."
Keilah's POV.
I clung to Damien as if letting go would shatter me into pieces I could never put back together. My sobs tore through me, loud and messy, but I didn't care. I couldn't stop. The weight of everything, the pain, the secrets, came crashing down all at once, spilling out of me like a dam that had finally given way. His arms wrapped around me, solid and unyielding, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. Truly safe. The kind of safety that came not from being protected, but from knowing deep down that someone understood me without judgment. I buried my face against his chest, the familiar scent of him grounding me even as my world spiraled. "I missed you," I whispered again, my voice breaking. Damien didn't say anything right away. His hand slid up my back, his touch firm yet soothing, as if silently promising me that he wasn't going anywhere. I needed that promise right now. I needed him to be here, solid and real, to hold me together while I fell apart. The sound of Ralph calling my name broke through the haze of my emotions, sharp and unwelcome. I stiffened but didn't let go. I couldn't face him right now. Not when the mere thought of him sent a fresh wave of anger and hurt crashing through me. "Keilah," Ralph's voice came again, low and strained. "We need to talk." Damien's grip tightened around me, his fingers pressing firmly into my back. I felt his power, his vampiric speed surging through him as he moved. The air around us blurred, and before I could even comprehend the sudden shift, the world around us shifted. I blinked, still wrapped tightly around Damien, my heart racing as I took in the new surroundings. His strong form was a wall of heat against me, and for a moment, all I could do was hold on to him, my face buried in his chest as my breath came in shaky gasps. Damien turned his head, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me feel exposed. His voice, though gentle, held an edge of concern and something darker. "What did Ralph do to you?" His words cut through the fog of my thoughts, his grip never loosening. Or was it his people? I slowly unwrapped my arms from around him, taking a hesitant step back. The distance between us felt strange but necessary. I swallowed hard, nodding. No, it wasn't Ralph or his people. Damien's eyes darkened, a growl barely contained in his throat. "Then why the hell were you crying, Keilah? Why are you hurting so badly? I can feel your heart torn apart. Even your face tells it all." His words were sharp and urgent, as though he needed answers as much as I needed to breathe. I hesitated, meeting his gaze, the weight of his scrutiny pressing down on me. For a moment, I wondered if I could tell him the truth. Could I really tell him that Ralph's actions had set everything in motion, that the pain I felt was tied to a future I wasn't sure I was ready for? But before I could speak, Damien snapped me back to reality, his voice cold with fury. "If they've touched you or threatened you, you tell me now, and I'll kill each one of them. If it means Ralph himself, so be it." Tears welled in my eyes at the sheer violence in his tone, his unflinching willingness to destroy anyone who dared harm me. I stared up at him, the words caught in my throat, my chest tight as I struggled to form a response. "Why?" I whispered, my voice breaking as I looked up at him, desperate for understanding. "Why, Damien?" Damien's expression softened just slightly, though there was still a raw edge to his gaze. His jaw tightened, but his eyes, those endless dark eyes, held a sorrow that I couldn't quite place. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming but oddly comforting as he reached out and cupped my face in his hand. His thumb brushed away the tears that had begun to streak down my cheeks, the warmth of his touch burning through me, grounding me. "Because I care about you, Keilah," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I always have." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. My heart skipped a beat at the admission, my breath catching in my throat as I looked up at him. There it was, the truth I had been avoiding, the truth I had known but never dared to acknowledge. Damien cared about me, perhaps more than I ever truly understood. "But why this?" I whispered, my voice trembling as I looked at him through the blur of my tears. "Why now? Why does it feel like everything is falling apart? Why is it so hard, Damien?" His hand fell from my face, but he remained close, his gaze never leaving mine. He looked like he wanted to say something, to reach into my soul and ease the pain there, but instead, he let out a long breath and clenched his fists, his gaze darkening once again. "Because life isn't kind," he said, his voice tinged with a bitterness I hadn't expected. "It never has been, and maybe it never will be." I shook my head, feeling my chest constrict as if the weight of his words was too much to bear. "But I don't know what to do anymore, Damien. I'm lost." Damien's eyes flashed with something fierce, a protective streak running deep beneath the surface. He reached out, pulling me close again, enveloping me in the same warmth and safety I'd felt when I first crashed into his arms. Damien held me until my breathing steadied, his presence solid and unwavering. The chaos in my mind began to quiet, replaced by the strange calm he always seemed to bring. Slowly, I pulled back, though his hands lingered on my arms as if afraid to let go entirely. I looked up at him, searching his expression, and asked, "How did you know I was here?" His gaze darkened slightly and he exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening for a moment before loosening. "There was this strange fae," he said, his voice laced with frustration and disbelief. "She seemed to know you a lot more than I expected. She told me where to find you." "A fae?" I repeated, frowning. "What kind of fae?" Damien shrugged but didn't elaborate. Instead, his gaze hardened as he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "What happened, Keilah? Did you wish to disappear again after everything we talked about? Do you know what it's like not being able to locate you? If it wasn't for that fae, I'd still be out there looking for you." His words stung, guilt slicing through me like a blade. "I didn't make any wish," I said softly, shaking my head. I found myself in the middle of the woods, standing across Ralph and Dahlia. They were trying to get Ralph's wolf." Damien went completely still, his expression unreadable. His silence stretched between us, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. "Is something wrong?" I asked hesitantly, the weight of his reaction pressing down on me. He brushed back the hair from his face, a gesture I recognized as a sign he was trying to compose himself. "Nothing," he said flatly, but the coldness in his tone was impossible to miss. Then, his expression hardened, his jaw tightening as his eyes locked onto mine. "What the fuck were you thinking, Keilah?" he snapped, his voice sharp enough to make me flinch. "What were you thinking making such a stupid deal with that witch?" The sudden shift in his demeanor hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth, but no words came out, his fury making it hard to even breathe. "Well," he demanded, stepping closer, "what the hell were you thinking, Keilah?" "I just wanted to help," I said quietly, shrugging as if it could lessen the weight of my actions. "Did you find the witch you were looking for?" Damien's glare intensified, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "That isn't fucking important here," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm talking about you. About your life, Keilah. Do you even understand what you've done?" I lowered my gaze, the heat of his anger bearing down on me. I thought I could fix things," I whispered. "You thought," Damien cut me off, his voice dripping with venom. "You thought you'd play hero, throw yourself into danger, and everything would magically work out?" He took a step back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You didn't just risk your life, Keilah. You risked everything. Do you even realize how reckless that was?" His words were harsh, but they were laced with an undercurrent of something else. Fear. I looked at him, really looked, and saw it in the tension of his shoulders, in the way his eyes darted to me like he was afraid I'd vanish again. "I'm sorry," I said softly, the words feeling inadequate. "I didn't mean to make things worse." "Come on," he said, wrapping his arm firmly around my waist. "I brought that witch with me. He'll give it back to you, and I'm not leaving until he does." Panic surged through me at his words. Instinctively, I grabbed his hand where it pressed against me. "No, Damien," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "I don't want it back." Damien froze at my words. The anger in his eyes dimmed, replaced by confusion, pain, and helplessness I rarely saw in him. "You don't want it back?" His voice, now softer, carried disbelief. "Keilah, this wasn't just something to give up. He stole a part of you, a part that was yours." I placed my trembling hand over his, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know, But Damien, if I have it back, what if I... My voice broke, and I had to swallow hard to get the words out. What if I get pregnant again? What if I lose another child? The silence that followed was suffocating. Damien stared at me, his jaw tightening as though he were physically holding back the words he wanted to say. I could see the internal battle waging within him, anger at my decision, frustration at my fear, and something deeper, understanding. I met his gaze, tears slipping down my cheeks unchecked. I can't go through that again, Damien. I can't. Losing him broke me in ways I can't even explain, and if it happens again, I don't think I'll survive it. Get me out of here, I said, my voice trembling as I clung onto him. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, the chill of the night biting against my skin. Please, just take me anywhere that's not Ralph's pack house. I don't care where. Damien's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes scanning me as though searching for something. But he said nothing. Without a word, he took off. When we finally broke through the air, Damien's car came into view. I blinked, momentarily disoriented, as the passenger door opened and a familiar figure stepped out. Alan? I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. But I couldn't muster the energy to feel the excitement I should have. My emotions were a tangled mess, and my body felt like it was running on fumes. Alan, get in the back, Damien ordered without so much as glancing at him. Alan looked between us but obeyed, sliding into the back seat without protest. Damien opened the passenger door and gestured for me to get in. Keilah. His voice was softer now, but it still carried that firm edge. I slipped inside, my movements sluggish, and closed the door behind me. Damien rounded the car and got into the driver's seat. He started the engine, the low hum breaking the heavy silence, and drove off without a single word. As the heat of the interior enveloped me, I leaned and closed my eyes, trusting Damien to take me away. I stretched my arms and slowly opened my eyes, expecting the familiar darkness of Damien's car. Instead, soft daylight filtered through the curtains, casting a gentle glow across the room. I blinked, momentarily disoriented, before a realization set in. It wasn't night anymore. Damien hadn't woken me up when we reached wherever we were going. I couldn't help but marvel silently. No matter how drained I had felt last night, I should have woken up when we arrived. Was there some kind of magic trick Damien used to make me sleep so deeply? A soft sigh escaped my lips as I sat up, the comfort of the bed wrapping around me. Whatever Damien did, I couldn't bring myself to complain. I felt good. Better than I had last night. Energetic even. It was like I could fly if I tried. Glancing around the room, I took in my surroundings. This was nowhere near Ralph's pack house, and it certainly wasn't the underworld. Morning light spilled across the walls, painting the gray wallpaper and matching curtains in a soft glow. 2 elegant armchairs sat in one corner, and a king-sized bed stretched under me, its thick comforter still warm from my sleep. I inhaled deeply. The air carried the scent of lavender, mingled with something else, something distinctly Damien. My breath caught as realization hit me. If this room could possibly be Damien's, then that meant he brought me to his house, to the Crimson Castle. A shiver ran through me at the thought, but not one of fear. Despite everything I'd been through, the knowledge that I was here filled me with a strange sense of security. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet sinking into the plush rug beneath me. Rising, I padded toward the bathroom, curiosity guiding me. Like the bedroom, it was large and elegant, the walls lined with polished tiles that gleamed under the soft lights. There was no toilet, just a massive glass shower, a clawfoot bathtub that practically screamed luxury, and pristine cabinets lining the wall. I turned the faucet, letting the cool water run over my hands before splashing my face. The droplets chased away the remnants of sleep, leaving me feeling more alive than I had at the Moonrise Pack. My reflection stared back at me in the mirror, brighter and more vibrant than the worn-out version I'd grown used to seeing at Ralph's pack house. Ralph. The thought of his name sent a shiver down my spine, though not the pleasant kind. He was my mate, yet every memory of him brought a strange combination of unease and pain. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. Then Damien's face surfaced in my mind, unbidden. Warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the chill Ralph's name had left behind. There was something about Damien, something that made me feel special, safe, and truly alive. A ridiculous warmth crawled up my neck. I slapped my cheeks lightly, scolding myself for the sudden naughty-like thought swirling in my mind. Why are you slapping yourself? Damien's voice startled me, and I whipped around to see him standing in the doorway of the bathroom. His tall frame leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, his eyes gleaming with faint concern. The door was open, he added, as if to excuse his unannounced presence. My mind flashed back to last night, his arrival at the Moonrise Pack, the way I'd bolted into his arms, clinging to him as though he were my lifeline. That hug. My cheeks flamed at the memory, the heat crawling all the way to the tips of my ears. I quickly turned back to the sink and splashed more water onto my face, hoping it would cool the blush spreading across my skin. Are you okay? Damien asked, his voice softening but still edged with concern. I'm good, I muttered, avoiding eye contact, focusing instead on the swirling water in the sink. Really okay, he pressed. Yes, really good, I snapped, nodding harshly as though trying to convince both of us. Any plans? Damien straightened, his casual posture giving way to his usual commanding presence. I need you out there. As I told you yesterday, I need the witch to return what he took from you. I froze, my head snapping toward him. Whatever fleeting warmth or strange emotions I'd been feeling moments ago vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, cold determination. My face hardened, my voice steady but laced with irritation. I thought I made it clear to you too, Damien, I said, my tone cutting. His gaze locked onto mine, unwavering. This isn't something to negotiate for, he replied, his voice firm. Come out, I'm waiting. And with that, he turned and walked out. I dried my face with one of the small towels stacked neatly in the basket. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the bathroom, my bare feet moving almost soundlessly against the floor as I made my way through the long hallway, its vastness striking as there wasn't a single door in sight. I turned down the stairs, and at the bottom of the stairs stood Damien, his presence as solid and unwavering as ever. He said nothing, simply nodded for me to follow, his strides purposeful. I trailed behind him, trying to ignore the way my stomach knotted with unease. He led me into a room that looked like a guest chamber, neutral decor, sparse furnishings. My gaze swept the room, and then I froze. Sitting casually in a chair was a woman I recognized instantly, long, dark hair framing her face, her striking features impossible to forget. My hand shot out, my finger trembling as I pointed at her, unable to believe what I was seeing. It's you, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The witch from the cafe. The one who vanished. She lifted her head, meeting my gaze. Yes, she said simply, her voice smooth as silk. It's me, have something to say? I chuckled, the sound dry and disbelieving. Wow, what a small world. You told me you hated vampires, warned me to stay away from Damien. And yet here you are, in the very vampire's grounds you supposedly hate. The witch leaned back, her lips curling into a slow, amused smile. Life's funny that way, isn't it? She said, her tone practically dripping with mockery. Now, are you going to keep stating the obvious, or should we skip to the juicy part where your vampire boyfriend either abandons you because he will or conveniently avoids telling you the truth about what you really are? Damien's low growl cut through the room, vibrating the air like a thunderclap. Enough, Marina, he said, his voice laced with authority that made the witch's smile falter, though only slightly. I couldn't stop but glare at him. He even knows her name. Marina turned her gaze to him, her smile sharpening like a blade. Touchy, are we? Did I hit a nerve, Mr. Vampire? Or is it that you don't want her to know just yet? What are you talking about? I demanded, stepping forward. My eyes darted between them, confusion battling with anger in my chest. If you have something to say, then say it. Stop playing games. Marina's eyes gleamed with a wicked glint as she turned back to me. Oh, sweet poor thing. Do you really think he's your savior? That he brought you here out of the goodness of his heart? She laughed, the sound cold and sharp. He has his reasons, and I assure you they're anything but selfless. I turned to Damien, agitation bubbling to the surface. What is she talking about? Is there something you're not telling me? And about abandoning me, is it true? Damien's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking briefly to the witch before snapping back to me. His voice was sharp and clipped. You don't have to listen to her. Focus on what matters, getting the witch to return what belongs to you. I don't need it, I shot back, my voice trembling with defiance. His eyes darkened, the sharp edge in his tone growing more pronounced. This is not up for negotiation, Keilah. You will listen to me and we'll deal with this. End of discussion. His raised voice made me flinch, a tremor running down my spine. I swallowed hard, my gaze darting between him and the witch, who was watching the exchange with an amused, knowing smirk. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, willing the trembling in my chest to subside. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words and lingering tension. When I opened my eyes, my voice was calm, almost too calm. All right, I get it, I said softly, my gaze steady on him. I'll oblige. But before we do this, can you at least tell me that what she said isn't true? Damien's expression hardened his features like stone. For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. The silence stretched. The only sound in the room was the faint creak of the witch shifting in her chair, watching us like a predator savoring the moment before the kill and the silent glare the shorty witch gave us. When Damien finally spoke, his voice was low but firm, each word hitting me like a blow. It's true. I blinked, my throat tightening as the air seemed to rush out of the room. What's true? I whispered, my voice barely audible. He met my gaze, unwavering, as if daring me to look away. You and I, we have to part ways. I locked eyes with Damien, trying to see if there was even the faintest hint of a joke in his expression, but his face was as stiff as stone. My stomach twisted painfully. You're joking, right? I asked, my voice tight, almost pleading. I'm not, Keilah. His tone was calm and measured. It's time I let you go. My mind reeled, the words hitting me like a slap. What the hell are you saying? It's been barely a few days since you told me I couldn't leave your side. Now you're saying this? What happened? I told you, vampires aren't trustworthy, Marina interjected smugly from the corner. I snapped my head toward her, glaring. You shut up! I'm not talking to you! She raised her hands in mock surrender, a smirk playing on her lips as she leaned back in her chair. I barely spared her another glance, but my gaze briefly flicked to the short witch sitting silently nearby, watching the exchange as if he didn't have a care in the world. I turned back to Damien, frustration bubbling under my skin. What's going on? I demanded, but instead of answering, Damien turned to the short witch. What's needed, and how long will it take to restore her belongings? Damien asked, his voice sharp, strained. The witch sighed heavily, like he'd explained this 100 times already. I told you, he said, his tone laced with annoyance. It's gone. I already used the spell and it can't be undone. Seems like that didn't sink in the first time I told you. Damien closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly struggling to keep his temper in check. But I was done keeping mine in check. My anger boiled over, heating my blood until I could barely think straight. I inhaled sharply, then exhaled with equal force, trying to steady myself. Without saying another word, I turned on my heel and stormed toward the entrance. Keilah, where are you going? Maureen's voice called after me. I stopped and spun around to face her. Behind her stood Tasha, Hustle, and Millie, their faces tense, their eyes silently asking the same question. To where I belong, I said simply, my voice steadier than I expected. Then, without waiting for a reply, I turned and walked out the door. As I stepped outside, I paused, my gaze darting around the familiar surroundings. This was where everything had started. Where Damien brought me after kidnapping me from the Moonrise Pack. Where he first bit me, marked me. This was where our connection began, whether I wanted it or not. But now everything feels different, tainted, It was clear now that he'd been using me all along, just like Ralph had. Both of them hurting me in their own ways. I wasn't special to him. Just another weak, ordinary human he couldn't take seriously. Fine, like I cared. I turned sharply, my anger propelling me toward the towering gates ahead. The vampires around me carried on with their business, indifferent to my presence. It was as if I didn't even exist to them. Even as I made my way out, no one so much as glanced in my direction, let alone tried to stop me. But then I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped and turned, already annoyed. It was the girls, Hustle, Maureen, Tasha, and Millie, all of them looking hesitant but determined. Don't follow me, I said firmly. We can't let you go out alone, Hustle said, stepping forward. King Draven won't like it if something happens to you. I took a deep breath and faced them fully, my voice steady but sharp. Listen, all of you. This isn't the underworld, this is the human world. Yes, vampires and werewolves exist, but I'm perfectly capable of looking out for myself. My gaze swept over each of them. And just so you know, your king and I have officially parted ways. This is me leaving him and all of you behind. Their silence was heavy, their faces conflicted, but I pressed on. I'm sorry I didn't get the chance to show you my world, my beautiful world, but this is how fate decided it. I paused, then shook my head bitterly. No, you know what? Don't blame fate for this. Blame your king. But even so, I'm grateful I got to meet people like you. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and kept walking, not looking back this time. When I reached the small gate, I pushed it open with more force than I intended. It slammed shut behind me with a loud clang, making me flinch even in my irritation. I clenched my fists, exhaling hard as I strode forward. I kept moving down the road, but my eyes darted back every few seconds, into the forest, over my shoulder, searching for any sign of danger. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the stupidest decision I'd ever made. Walking through an empty road in the middle of a forest, alone? It was like I had a death wish. Any supernatural being out there could attack me and, let's face it, plenty of them probably wanted me dead. I stopped, sighing heavily as I dropped onto the edge of the woods, my legs burning from walking too long. My chest rose and fell with my ragged breaths as frustration bubbled inside me. What the hell was I even thinking? I swore under my breath, raking a hand through my hair. I was completely out of my mind to believe I could just walk my way out of this place. To where exactly? Where was I even supposed to go? I glanced back in the direction I'd come from, the thought of returning tugging at me for a moment. But then I thought about the distance I'd already walked. No way. Going back wasn't an option. Not after everything. And yet, the embarrassment of how I'd stormed out earlier hit me hard, acting like some hot-headed fool. God, I was such an idiot. I let myself fall back into the soft grass, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment, I stared up at the sky, letting the cool breeze brush over my face. The weather was perfect. Blue skies dotted with lazy, fluffy clouds, the kind of calmness that felt at odds with everything going on inside me. Then, out of nowhere, a flash of white caught my eye. A bird, its feathers almost glowing in the sunlight, soared gracefully across the sky. I narrowed my eyes as it flew in front of me, almost as if it wanted to make sure I noticed it. It wasn't long before it turned sharply, heading straight toward me. My breath hitched as I sat upright, scrambling back slightly in case it planned to dive bomb my face. But just as quickly it slowed, hovering in front of me, lingering as if it had a purpose. I chuckled softly, tilting my head at the strange creature. Hey, little bird. Are you here to keep me company? Or did someone send you? The bird didn't answer, of course, but it flapped its wings and flew past me, heading toward the forest. I followed its path with my eyes as it lingered midair again, almost expectantly. Leaving so soon? I called out with a light smile. But the bird didn't leave entirely. It hovered as though waiting for me. The longer I stared at it, the more it felt like it wanted me to follow. A frown tugged at my lips. You want me to follow you, huh? I muttered under my breath, standing reluctantly. I hope this isn't another dumb decision, I added as I took my first steps toward the bird. It flew deeper into the forest, just slow enough that I could keep up. My nerves prickled with each step, the dense trees swallowing me whole, the shadows growing darker the farther I went. At some point, the bird darted ahead, disappearing entirely. I stopped in the middle of the forest, panic clawing at me as I realized I was completely alone. Just as my chest began to tighten, the bird reappeared, its wings catching the light as it fluttered toward me again. This time, it seemed to move more deliberately, slowing as if aware it had been moving too fast. You know, I huffed as I followed it again. This might be the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life, following a random bird into a forest. I don't even know why I'm doing this, but here I am, following you like I've been put under some kind of spell. I sighed, shaking my head. Could you at least tell me where you're taking me? My feet are killing me. The bird didn't answer, of course, but I suddenly noticed a faint glimmer of light ahead, flickering through the trees in the distance. My curiosity piqued as I quickened my pace. What is that? I asked the bird, even though I knew it couldn't reply. When I finally broke through the dense woods, I stumbled into a clearing and froze. In the center of the clearing was a pond, its water crystal clear and shimmering unnaturally under the sunlight. I stared at it, stunned by its beauty. Before I could process the sight or question the bird about why it had led me here, the water began to stir. Ripples spread across the surface, and then the water rose, forming a shape. A portal, glowing faintly as though beckoning me forward. I turned to the bird, which now hovered in front of me, almost expectantly. It flapped its wings once, gave me what looked like a playful wiggle, and then, without hesitation, dove straight into the water portal. I blinked, staring at the spot where it disappeared. My heart pounded as I whispered to myself, what the hell have I gotten myself into now?